Green light is on, that means the microphone is live. So turn your green lights off. Thank you. This is the February 29th, 2024 Citizens Bond Oversight Committee meeting. Calling that to order at 6:02. We have a couple of members who one will be late and one may not make it. So I'm going to ask Anna to call the roll, please.
Okay, Roger Peters.
Here.
Gabriel Berzik.
Here.
Shen Choi.
Present.
Michael Fleischman.
Here.
Suzanne Podell is not here. Tyler Will.
Here.
Melissa McClatchy is also unable to be here. Chris Bailey. Eunice Hong, not here. And Joy Koo, not here.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Let's see, I want to start off with the approval of the agenda and just to explain to the other members, the agenda was prepared in advance of Tuesday's Board of Trustees meeting. I think it's still a reasonable way to go, but I'm open to any suggestions for changing order of any items. Seeing no response, okay. May I have a motion to approve the agenda, please?
Motion to approve. Second.
Is there something? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. The agenda is approved. Now we'll go to public comment on items that are not on the agenda. So I'm open to anyone coming forward or online for items that are not covered by the agenda. We'll wait a minute or so. No online? Anybody local? Okay, we'll proceed then to welcome introductions. So welcome to the public here. I recognize that probably the numbers in this space are less than would have been the case perhaps before last Tuesday. We moved it to the library in anticipation, so I can't say I'm displeased to see a smaller crowd here. But, welcome to you all taking the time, and for those of you online, appreciate time that you're taking to participate in an important public issue. I'll start with the introductions of two new members. First, Gabe Burchek. Gabe just joined us. Gabe, if you'd like to introduce yourself and give any comments, please do so.
Sure. I love a microphone. Gabriel Burchek, moved my company here about 5 years ago to Miller Avenue, and slowly have started to navigate the who, the what, the where of Mill Valley. And a couple days ago, I thought I was going to be jumping into I'm glad it got resolved, but I was helpful in starting the Mill Valley Music Festival here, and I care very much about what we do for our businesses and what we do for our community. And it's been an honor that I was approved to be able to serve on this committee. Boy, I got cut off already. Whew. Is it just a minute? Oh,
Are you finished?
I'm finished.
Thank you. Second, Michael Fleischman.
Hi, nice to meet everyone. My name is Michael Fleischman. I've had 3 kids in the school district, 2 right now at Edna and Mill Valley Middle School. And in addition, professionally, I've spent about 16 years working in the municipal bond industry. So it's something close to my heart, and I'm really looking forward to working with everyone.
Thank you, Michael and Gabe, and again, welcome. I thought what I would do is give a little bit of a background on what the Bond Oversight Committee's charge is. For those who are not familiar, many of you, I'm sure, are following it and have probably read through a lot of the documents. But generally, as a result of Proposition 39 that allowed school districts to adopt bonds with a 55% voter approval, There was a condition imposed subsequently by legislation as well, that as an effort to make sure there was a cost-effective use of those funds and there was no fraud or waste of those funds, that a Citizens Oversight Committee be established in connection with those bond proceedings and how they're used. So the Mill Valley School District adopted a Citizens Bond Oversight Committee in, I think, November of last year. Excuse me, November of 22. And so we're here today. Basically, I think that the essential elements on an oversight committee are it is an independent committee, as indicated by the legislation. What that means exactly, I think, is a gray area at times, because we work very closely with the school district to make sure that we're seeing things and we'll continue to do so in that fashion. So there's some separation and some working together. The requirement is that we take a look at what the bond authorization is and to see if the bonds are spent for authorized purposes. And then specifically, we're to look at whether or not bonds are expended for teacher salaries or administrative salaries or other operating costs of the school district. So those are the responsibilities that are put on this entity. It has a requirement to report to the public as well as to the district. And the consistency of the committee was set by legislation in a way that sets a cross-section of the community involved, and the community involved would be the voters of the school district. So there are representatives, each of the individuals here represent either a specific group, for example, those participating in an ELPR organization, which is where I fall, taxpayer organization. And then there are some open, undesignated spots as well. I see the Bond Oversight Committee's function to look at the efficient utilization of bonds and to make sure that it's consistent with the authorization and that we get what we can in terms of the resources and the benefits that the voters were hoping we would get in authorizing what is a considerable and long-lasting obligation on their part. So that's the background on the Bond Oversight Committee. A couple of other points. We have a set of bylaws that we follow. Those bylaws were adopted by the Board of Trustees. They can be amended by the Board of Trustees, and the Board of Trustees also authorizes who's going to, selects who's going to sit on the Bond Oversight Committee. It's not uncommon for oversight committees to take a look at the bylaws and make suggestions where the bylaws maybe are unclear or need some clarification. We did that in this instance relating to some fair political practices reporting obligations to make sure that sitting on this committee wouldn't be a burdensome disclosure obligation. So I would expect we'll be looking at the bylaws generally as we go through our process. As far as how we're going to proceed tonight, given the particular interest that the middle school has had for most of the participants so far, I should say I have looked at, and I suspect other members here have looked at many, if not all, of the recent meetings. So I've looked at, that's, I guess, the last 3 Board of Trustees meetings, watched them, including the special meeting and also the community meeting. So I think there's a fair understanding, at least among some of us, and I hope most of us, that we see the issues. I set this up because the middle school was such a predominant issue that we're going to hear about the middle school first and see what the update is for the middle school. And then we're going to talk about what the bond authorization is for the middle school or generally. And then we're going to proceed to the other facilities to get an update on those. And then we'll go to business of the committee, which includes discussing how we're going to operate. And I should say I'm the acting chair as designated under the bylaws by the supervisor. And so we're going to now eventually, after clearing out some of the issues I referred to earlier in the bylaws, going to go to an election at the end of this meeting. So that's the outline. I hope that's reasonably comprehensive for your understanding of how we're going to proceed. And then I'd like to go to the next item, which is item D. And the first sub-item is middle school project. I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce a couple of members, a couple of individuals, and two of them are coming up now. But I note in the audience are one of the Board of Trustees members, Young Hee Yu, and Elizabeth Kaufman, our supervisor, is also present. Will you introduce yourself and then proceed? Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Julio Arroyo, Director of Maintenance Operations and Safety for the Mill Valley School District. And with me tonight is Sandrine Hitchcock, who's with AECOM, who's our program manager for Measure G. So starting off is just to give a background of Measure G. So really the goal of Measure G is to transform our facilities, modern and teaching and learning for Mill Valley School District. So the thought and the vision was a vision for today and tomorrow, building for today and the future for generations, and including in Measure G at a high level, it's modernize, upgrade, renovate, and repair school buildings, classrooms, and other facilities across the district, as well as create modern, accessible, and beautiful learning facilities in service of Mill Valley students and family for generations to come. Provide every student with the best possible educational environment every day, setting them up for success and in the future. And then replace a new middle school building to replace the current school, which was built in 1972. And so really the focus of that construction project is this building that we're in now. I'm going to have Sandrine talk about some of the architectural focus and some of the design elements that we've been looking into as we plan for a new middle school replacement.
Good evening. So if you followed the meeting on Tuesday, the Board of Trustees special meeting, there was a presentation about several options for the middle school. And this portion of the presentation really applied to any location, right? Is how the design is going to be approached regardless of the location. So we just wanted to remind everyone that as we design buildings, especially public schools in this case, we don't just look at natural light, natural ventilation, indoor air quality, but we're going to look at a lot of different factors that are going to influence the design. And that includes also spatial environment, like the school design by itself, how it looks, but also factors such as relationships, learning and teaching, relationship with community, etc. So regardless of location, these factors would be looked at by the design team. So we're going to show you two of the options that were presented on Tuesday. As you're well aware, on Tuesday, the Board of Trustees provided direction to look at rebuilding the middle school on the existing site. So we're going to look at concept A and concept B only tonight. The main difference between the two is essentially 1-story versus 2-story. Concept A was the original one, which is a 2-story building and renovation of the existing gymnasium. Option B is essentially based on the feedback we received from the steering committee. And later I'll explain who is the steering committee and what they do. But essentially the feedback we got was that they wanted outside access from each classroom. So we kind of looked at what that footprint would look like. And our intent is to bring at the next board meeting these two options back with a little more details on the cost. And again, aside from looking at environmental and physical aspects, As you know, the California code has is pretty up there when it comes to sustainability. So regardless, we would look at a lot of aspects related to sustainability for the design of the middle school. So I mentioned the steering committee, and we had one, I think the last one was 2 or 3 weeks ago. And during that meeting, we specifically asked the steering committee not to give any feedback on site location. But the discussion was around design elements that would be driving the design of the school. So we kind of had like a voting session with the steering committee and gathered the results for you. So we asked them, as far as collaboration spaces, what type of spaces they would prefer. And all of them chose to remain with the pod configuration. As far as science integration, they, instead of segregating science, they want to integrate science within each grade level. When it comes to the classroom massing, so essentially option A or option B, 1 or 2 story, they were divided 50-50. And they made some comments about the site location, even though we didn't ask for it, but it's really a split between the two. And then finally, we asked them if there was some money left. We have currently allowances in our estimates for site mitigation. If there was some money left, where would they see that money going towards? Either for the multi-purpose, a more in-depth renovation of the multi-purpose building, or providing more enclosed spaces, gathering spaces. Again, it was a little split, but most were more in favor of the multi-purpose upgrade. So these, and I'm not going to go in all the details, but these were the options for pods and collaboration spaces that were presented to them. And as you saw, they all selected the pod configuration. So the next step for the design team is essentially going to be to take all this feedback and advance the design to incorporate the feedback from the steering committee. So those were visuals that came along with each option that the team presented to the steering committee. Again, a different type of configuration.
And I just want to add, for those who may not be familiar with the middle school site, so the way each corner of the building is set up is we have our core classrooms, and then there's a science room. And then outside of those rooms, we have a pod. And so that's where teachers have students learning in small groups, or we have students learning individually there. And so it's like a collaboration space. And that's been something that's been successful throughout the years. And so it's something that's really important for the staff that's part of the steering committee. And so we have a member represented from each of our staff members. So that a core teacher, we have a math teacher that was part of that group. We have somebody representing PE. We had somebody representing the arts. We had our administrators, the middle school administrators, the principal, the vice principal, administrators from our IT staff and special education, as well as teachers from special education. So those were the groups that comprise the steering committee. And so I just kind of wanted to give some, for those who may not be familiar with how the school's laid out, and that's what kind of drove what some of the design and requests were from the staff for the new building.
Thank you. Thank you. I neglected to outline the procedure that we're going to follow going forward. Once the presentation is made, then members of the committee have an opportunity to ask questions. And we'll go through whatever questions they have. And after that, we'll have public comment, and we'll listen to the public comment. And after that, we will have a deliberation. And if action is required, then we'll take action if it's for consideration for later action, then we'll table it until later action. So at this point, I open up to any of the members, including the alternates, to ask any questions on what you've seen so far. Chris?
Yeah, so I think the fundamental question is still, there's been a lot of action since Tuesday. It's a little bit jumping forward to be talking about just design. I think at least myself and members I hear in the community where the question remains is rewind a few weeks ago. And we're sitting looking at, going down the Friends Field route. I think the first question the public wants to understand is beyond what's on the page of the statement, what actually caused us to divert from Friends Field. I know citing of complexity and litigation, all these things were teed up as the reason. I think more specifically, though, the public is wanting to understand there's litigation risks on anything we do at any type of school project. That was made very clear by the school board previously, the district previously. But I think specifically people want to understand why are we orienting back to this site? And if we are orienting back to this site, how are we addressing all the challenges that were brought up in multiple board presentations before, such as what is temporary housing going to be? Where is it going to be? We're rushing towards, and this is where the role of the CBOC comes in. We're rushing towards a $15 million expenditure, as far as I understand, on March 7th. And we still have not presented, number one, a safe environment for where that temp housing is going. And number two, we still haven't presented a budget that is going to leave any room for elementary school expenditure. And so I know those are the biggest concerns I continue to hear from the community. And to address those concerns, especially because we're looking at a budget right now that with soft costs is $190 million. There's nothing left for elementary school build without state funding. Why would we not go and present again Edna as an option or other options such that we can extend that? And I know you guys have been tortured on this, but we took the whole public through a presentation multiple times where we actually said, hey, we actually think that there are good reasons to pivot off of this site. And now we're just expecting people to go back to feeling comfortable without addressing the concerns that originally existed with this site.
Was that a question or a statement?
There were 3 questions in there. So how are we going to spend $15 million on temp housing when we don't know where it's going? It can't be situated on a floodplain sitting on blacktop. That's not a safe spot for our kids to be. So is the temp housing going to go on Friends Field, or where is it going to go if this is the option we're pursuing? And how are we going to stay within the budget of the bond measure and still have room for elementary schools?
Yeah, I can get started and Sandrine can weigh in. What we don't have tonight here is what has been previously presented is a temporary classroom setup that we're gonna have, that we've planned out. And so part of the additional classrooms are gonna be on the parking lot. We're outside of the gym right now. And then above that, where the blacktop is, that's where the majority of the classrooms get added. We do have to build that. We do have to build like a deck structure high enough to be able to be above the floodplain. And so that's been part of our due diligence leading up to the design, as well as the process that we'll follow with the appropriate agencies to make sure that we're meeting the regulations. And we've reached out to different agencies that Sandrine can touch base of what we've done so far in terms of our due diligence and analysis and who we've brought on so far to help us make these decisions and around the design. The second piece is around, I think your second question was around the cost of the middle school relative to the elementary schools. And so part of the board decision that happened at our regular board meeting in January was to set up our middle school budget to include state funding. And so we are moving forward as planned with elementary schools, and that's part of our second presentation, part of our information in D3 to give an update on our master schedule for the elementary schools. So that is moving forward as planned. There's not there hasn't been a change in that. And so our plan is to make up the difference of funding that we need for the middle school through state funding. And at that point, be able to understand, as well as the leaseback contract, it's set up with a finance component to be able to make up the difference for the cash flow. And so that's how we fix the cash flow issues for the middle school, but the elementary schools are not part. So that funding is there. So it's more of the middle school where we're using state funding to make up the difference that you talked about.
Yeah, but I see, I understand the cash flow lease back. I'm still.
So we're not going to have a debate back and forth.
It didn't answer the question though. So there's $194 million budget approved, correct? There's $190 million with soft cost expenditure expected for this facility itself. Right? And we're going to sign up contracts to contractors to do it. You have to have a bridge funding of some sort, is what you're suggesting,
Yeah.
to get to the state funding.
For the middle school, because the elementary school will be on its own. That is outside of that will be the fix for the middle school.
Who's providing that bridge funding?
So once we get to the point of where we've got the designs and we know we've gone through the environmental process, so we have an understanding of what's going to be our guaranteed maximum price, and we're already in the process of coming up with different options, but all that will line up at the point where we will then present to the board. These are our best options for financing to go forward.
I think your question, who is financing? Essentially, I want to go back to the RFPs we issued for leaseback. And if you look in those contracts that were approved, only the middle school contract with Flint includes the financing component, and it's specific to the middle school. So again, going back to what Julio was saying, there is no financing or for the elementary school modernizations at all. It all comes from Measure G. So the only financing component that will be part of that GMP and is for the middle school only. So to answer your question, it is Flint,
So,
through Flint.
so we, under the current bond measure, we're allowed to spend more money or commit ourselves to more money than the 194. If we don't get if we don't get the state funding, because we won't know if the state funding comes through by the time we're committing to a construction project.
You
So
will know by November.
I'm going to cut off the conversation at this point. We've had enough back and forth.
Excuse me, can I understand why you would cut this off? I find
This
this
is kind of
interesting.
fundamental to the CBOC, is to understand sources and uses of funds and making sure that we have enough money to move forward before we make a $15 million commitment. I mean, I think that's the entire role. Like I have less than an opinion actually on the design of the school. It's more, how do the sources and uses fit together, right?
Okay.
So
Can I
still
suggest
don't
we
understand.
do D3 and hear the rest of the budget, and then we can come back if we need it. The D3 they will present other school projects.
I'm sorry, I thought this was open for questioning at this point, and
Yep.
now you want to move on?
I
Other
think he
people
said, I think he
did-
said that it would be covered later and then we could come back to it. But
Oh, his
I think-
questions will be answered later.
I think we
That's
go ahead.
That's my suggestion.
Okay, I don't think it will be covered later because this is covered just by sourcing and uses. And it is a key question that you and he brought up in multiple board meetings. I still haven't heard a clear answer. I haven't seen a clear answer in any of it, which is the bond authorization allows us to take on a certain amount of, I literally do this for a living, finance, so I'm not like dull to it. I'm trying to understand, how do we move forward with making early expenditure decisions today when we don't yet know if we have the total funds. And that's just a source and uses question. If there's a way, if you have a presentation slide that's going to clearly lay that out, I'm happy to wait. But I haven't seen it in any board presentation yet. I haven't seen a CBOC presentation. So I do think it's an important question. Not to mention that I think overall committing the school and the district to 190 where it just hits on the nose is a little bit dangerous. I don't think anybody would do a house remodel where, sources and uses perfectly fit. You'd be sitting there wanting to make sure that you're scoping a project and bidding a project where you had more than a 30%, soft contingency budget. But this is a question I know that comes up all across the board. I don't feel like it's been clearly addressed, and it's literally functional to the CBOC. The other thing that was not addressed in the temporary housing question is how are we actually going to protect the kids from that? And is there been any studies on having a construction project next to where the temp housing is, if that's actually going to pass muster for not only like what you're required to do, but from, just what people are going to feel comfortable with? It's right there, right?
So I think you raised good questions. Thank you for that. And I'm going to move on at this point and hear the rest of the presentation later on.
I'm a little confused.
Okay.
Sorry. You opened it up for questions and these seem like important questions. I've tried to read a lot these last few days and get myself up to speed, but I mean, the question is, are we really going to make a decision here on March 7th about spending $15 million? And there's a lot of these unanswered questions. I think it's worthy of our time to flush this out. Well, help me understand the urgency to move on.
All right. I'll accept your position. Can you respond to those questions? And if it's something that's going to be presented to the district at some point, then I think it would be useful for us to hear after it's been presented.
Sure. So the first question is about the 190 million and the 15 million for the interim housing.
Yeah, first question is, we're trying to make a decision on March 7th. Is it still, we're trying to make a decision on 15 million? And if that is an urgent decision, why? Because what I'm looking at is we just went down the route of we're going to save $6 to $8 million on the Friends Field. Even with that budget, we were topping up, right? We're topping up right up against $190 million budget. So we're still at $190 million budget here for middle school alone. I understand sort of there might be some vendor financing, essentially, for lack of a better word, right? Bridge financing from the contractor here at the middle school. But what happens if that's just a bridge to the state funding, if the state funding doesn't come back? How do we pay back the contractor?
So if you don't mind, I'm going to go back a little bit more like high level when it comes to state funding. It is very typical for school districts to seek state funding for projects in addition to bonds, local bonds available. State funding is based on number of students, essentially, and it's every 25 and 50 years resets. And we are essentially at the end of that period. And the next state funding available reset is approaching. So when we started the project, we looked at, is there any money available that the district hasn't touched that the district is eligible to get? And if the state cannot say no, like if you submit your application, you're in line and essentially eventually you get funding based on number of students, based on eligibility. So the question is not if, it's when. So based on, and we had, I believe, several times, Chris DeLong from HPD, our state funding consultant, come present like all the scenarios, best case scenario, worst case scenario, when that money would come. He presented also what's currently available, what we're going after, and what will be available. One thing to keep in mind too is when we ask for money. So right now we're asking for reimbursement for projects that have been done by the district in the past. And that money could be used towards Measure G projects. So we're accounting for that additional money for Measure G projects, specifically for the middle school. Next year, when we have the new eligibility, that we can apply for that money and essentially get it into 3 years. And we can already plan, if we decide to go for the money and account for it for the middle school, we can plan the middle school based on that amount. If we wait to get the money 3-4 years down the road, we would not be able to apply it to the middle school alone. We would have to spend it for each individual projects, for each individual site. So how it is broken down based on when we go for that money is a little different. So our recommendation was account for the money you know you're gonna get and plan it towards the middle school. Because you can apply all of it towards the middle school, and you can essentially rebuild the school and do everything the master plan was envisioning without compromise. So when it comes to the financing part, the problem is not just only the 20 million, let's call it 15, 20 million. The problem is the cash flow when the bond money will be available. As you know, we can't get 194 million at once. There is a schedule. We already got Series A funds in August last year. The next one, I believe, is towards the end of the year, Series B, which will be around $75 million. But once we start construction on the middle school, the expenditure is going to be so much higher, we won't be able to catch up, right? There won't be enough money in the bank to pay for it.
What's the interest rate again on the lease back? And is that all baked into the?
That will have, and I'm getting to that point, there's multiple parts, but essentially we have a cash flow problem. It's not just the 15 million over. So that's a problem we need to resolve, and leaseback allows us to do that. Because we can finance that amount until we get the next bond series and then reimburse it. So we're looking, there's probably right now, based on the schedule of bond sales, there's probably going to be two different financing portion. The last part has to do with the GMP. So as we design and as we are more able to reduce unknowns or better price or reduce allowances or increase them, until we reach GMP, which will be right when we, at the end, essentially, of construction documents and permitting, there's no commitment. Like, until the district agrees to a maximum or guaranteed maximum price, there is no decision.
Yeah.
There is no commitment until everybody agrees to the guaranteed maximum price. And that's not until a year from now. In November, we will know whether or not the state measure passes, which is the next big state funding. And in history, there's only been one time where that hasn't passed. So there's no guarantee it will pass, but there's a high level of confidence.
That's very helpful. Thank you. I think the main thing I just get concerned about still is the contingency, right?
Mhm.
Between what we're scoping on the project right now and where we're spending resources and engineering resources and everything else. And seems to be a very small room for error on where we're guessing pricing is going to be and how we're scoping it. So the way we're doing the design, are we going to be able to like down scope easily if things come back higher than we expect?
As you know, there's always, scope. Scope is always an option, cutting scope. But right now, what I will tell you, and you've probably seen that in the previous board meetings when we were presenting cost, we have $7.5 million aside for mitigation. Like, that's a big pocket, right? Of are we going to need to spend 7.5 million? Maybe not. So as we proceed with the environmental studies, which we have Nino and Moore under contract right now, and they will start that process. We expect that by midsummer, by July, we will have all the test results. We will have a plan. We will have talked to DTSC. So we will be able to refine essentially how much money we need to put towards mitigation, right? It might be the whole 7.5 million, it might be half of it. We know we're gonna have to spend something. But we have contingencies right now that we will refine as we move forward.
And that 7.5, was that based on just some type of other proxies for this? Where did that come from?
I will have to ask Flynn for more details, but they are experienced in public schools. They've done mitigations on projects. Most public schools have some sort of mitigation. So I can get an answer from you, for you.
So I just to hit the one other like major question I know that's from the community is the temp housing sitting there.
All right, so your question was about the floodplain.
Floodplain and
Right.
and toxicity next to a construction site.
All right, so floodplain first. We know that the only building on this campus right now that is above floodplain is the multipurpose building. So if we look at every building, we're below that. When we design and build interim housing, even though it's called interim housing, the state requires us to design and build them as if they were permanent structures. So we would have to meet every requirements, including being above floodplain, even for the interim housing. So I think that answers your question about the floodplain.
Yeah, you're gonna lift it up.
We are planning on changing grades. Yes, and that is part of that's why it's $15 million too for the interim housing. When it comes to the soil, again, as part of the process, whether it's for the interim housing or the new buildings, we have to build to the standard of new buildings regardless. So we are going to have the interim housing as part of the CEQA process and the CEQA review and the environmental review. So again, that it's not just for the new construction, it's also for the interim housing.
Other questions?
Just a handful or two.
Sure.
Just a more recent one that I wrote down here. You talk about the $7.5 million for mitigation, and you said that there's a case study or other projects where you base that cost on other types of projects. Is it based on a school in a flood zone and where we are in this area?
So when I was talking about 7.5 million, I'm talking specifically about soil mitigation, not addressing the floodplain, or that's part of the site work itself. It's another number. This is specifically for the soil condition.
The soil, and is it because of there's something wrong with the soil?
So the site was a landfill. So that's part of the environmental review process where we're going to have to essentially address the condition of the site and the soil.
Okay. And so these expenses that you're estimating here for that is based on knowns of soils of our type.
So two things. We do have data from the previous borings, from previous project from the community center, actually, that and reports, and there are public reports also on the DTSC website, on I believe the county website, that essentially this is a known fact. This was a landfill. There's been testing. There is monitoring. So we have the data. Nino and Moore, with an environmental engineering firm, was hired back in November, I believe, and reviewed all those reports and essentially gave an opinion at that time that there wasn't anything unusual that would prevent the district from building or developing the land. And that the next step essentially would be to go through DTSC and do additional testing and come up with a remediation plan.
Okay. Just a question in terms of what sounds like a big decision to make here. $15 million on March 7th. Is that, I'm new to this. So is that accurate? That we need to make a commitment? It seems like there's a lot of unanswered questions, and that's a kind of a big commitment to make.
So I'm assuming you're referring to the interim housing,
Yes.
15 million?
Yeah.
So part of the previous board meetings, discussions were obviously we were exploring different locations for the new school. On Tuesday, the board indicated that we need to focus on the current location. So eliminate Friendsfield. Rebuilding on the existing site would require interim housing. The Friendsfield option, that was one of the positive where we would essentially keep students and teachers in the existing building, build somewhere else and move everybody just once. Rebuilding on this site would mean moving out people from this building, meaning needing interim housing for them. So that's the $15 million that come with the direction to rebuild on the same site.
Okay. Has there been bids for this work? And I guess I have another question. Who's the design team and how many concepts have come up? There's Starbucks and they have teams that come up and they say, hey, we need coffee shops. And so this is the perfect coffee shop. Is there a Schools R Us, like architectural firm that understands what's important for schools that have proposed concepts?
So back, when was it, June?
Back in last spring, we went out for a request for proposals for an architect pool. And part of that is to bring on to get request bids for our modernizations, which are our elementary school projects, as well as our middle school project. And so through that process, it's a public process where we had folks submit their bids to be able to create a pool. We then brought forward 3 architects into that pool. 2 that were going to be assigned to the elementary schools, and then 1 was going to be for the middle school. And the firm that was assigned and approved by the board for the elementary school site was Lionakis. And so that's who we've been, I'm sorry, for the middle school site, Lionakis, that's who we've been working with since they came into contract around July. And so we've been working at that point. They initially started with the process around, our process was first to evaluate is this the best site to build on? Do our other sites, is there a better ability to build our elementary school sites? So we started this process to reviewing all our elementary school sites as well as this site to say, what's the best school to be able to build the new middle school? And so we went through that process, and part of that process is really is defined by the California Department of Education and their requirements of the size based off your student population and acreage. And so based off that study is that immediately dropped out most of our schools, because generally our schools, we have a smaller footprint with our schools. So really we were looking at that point at Edna McGuire or this site. And given that Edna McGuire had been a new build back in 2010 and been a new investment by the community, as well as the disruption we would have to have by moving the Edna McGuire students out to predominantly Tam Valley and Strawberry, because that would be the only other school we would have space to put additional classrooms for. It was actually our longest and most costliest estimate when we looked at everything. We also have a private school that sits on that side. We have other district offices that also would need to be relocated. So that was the initial analysis. And when that analysis was put forward, to answer your question, we had concepts here on the middle school, which I believe we had 3 at that for the middle school, and then we had 1 for Edna McGuire. And so that was the initial concept. And then the board decided at that point that based off the information that was provided at that point, that this site was the best school. And so we focused on this school to be able to bring forward additional concepts. And that's when we also brought forward the Friendsfield. Shortly after that, we brought forward the Friendsfield option. So we were looking at the option here, building at Friendsfield, as well as here on this initial site. And then that's been the board's deliberation for the last 3 board meetings, or around 2 board meetings. And so they decided to then build on this site. So that's how we got here. There's been different concepts that got us to this point. Some included some without temporary classrooms, some with, but that's how we're here.
Thank you for bringing me up to
Chloe,
speed here.
there's one thing I wasn't clear on, like, was there an actual estimate done on Edna? Because I don't think that was ever made public if there was a real number put to that scheme. We've never seen a real number. And now that we're still sitting here with this site and at the limit of the budget, it'd be helpful, I think, for CBOC, for the public to see, was there an actual number put to the Edna scheme? There was just a presentation presented where it could be expensive. There was no type of dollar figure ever shared on.
What was presented at that point was we would need to, part of the timeline it would take to be able to move the Edna students, build it at the other school sites, move the Edna students over, and based off that timeline and what we understand of the cost and inflation, that was the relative understanding of just the total cost, and it would be the most costless plus disruptive to that campus and the student having moved students around. And so that was the analysis done at that point.
I have a couple of questions. Are you finished?
Oh. Will I be able to ask questions more, or is this
Go ahead.
all are done?
You asked about the 7th, March 7th, and why the pressure on March 7th. And from what I understand, is this, it's not one day equals one day. We push it to the 9th, that's all, that's 2 days will give us 2 more days of time. It's a whole school year that gets lost if we don't make the decision within this window. So if we don't decide where we're gonna go at this moment in time, we basically lose a year because the students will not have a place to go.
So,
I-
so fiscal responsibility versus this, I mean, I'm sorry to say this, but is waiting a year a bad decision if there's better decisions that are made? I'm just,
Wasn't commenting on the decision why that is, I'm trying to explain why the March 7th. We can do that, we can debate whether that's the right thing to do. We can debate whether that's the right framework to use, but that is why the pressure on the March 7th, which is why all the frenetic activity in February to evaluate this Friends Field, which only became a possible opportunity in January. So that's where all this kind of, because they've had a very regular pace of communicating information and evaluating different options. And as we got closer to March, more ideas are coming on the table and more sort of perspectives are being brought to the table.
Yeah, thank you. There's two points, just this is questions back and forth. When we get to deliberation, you can talk. All right, so let's just focus on questions.
okay. And just, I participated in this flood area here, and, it seems like, California and a lot of officials here in the Bay Area are taking it pretty serious here. And, here we have this site, and here we're going to spend all this money, in 20 years or 30 years or 50 years, they're projecting, a big change. How long is this school supposed to last? And, is it being built for 50 years, for 75 years, for 100 years? What's the lifespan of a school?
Typically, we're looking, 50 to 60, just like this school is over 50 years. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. How about future costs to maintain a school that is built in this type of area? Or I don't know what happens with flooding, and we'd have to depend on people who are experts in this, but my understanding is not just the top water that comes from flooding, but also the water that comes up from the ground. Isn't that going to be a lot more expensive, and we might have to deal with fixing something that we built that doesn't really work anymore in the future? Or has that been already addressed and I'm just repeating things?
Could
'Cause
you
it-
repeat the
it's- it-
question?
Have we, it's understood, or we're planning for a lot of flooding in our area, and the cost of that is astronomical in terms of the numbers I've seen. Have we considered the factor that we're building something that in 50 years is going to have risk of what is happening here in the Bay Area?
So a few meetings ago, board meetings ago, the Lionakis team present, I think it was actually in September, October. They presented all the FEMA maps and essentially showing, 25 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now. And essentially the worst case scenario, this site is an island, right? We can address and we will address floodplain on this site, but unfortunately we can't address it for the entire city, right? So the worst case scenario is essentially this building will be above the water, but inaccessible, right? So we are addressing the design from that standpoint because we are required to, regardless from with CEQA. And actually there's new California law that will require even more stringent requirements. So we are addressing it for this site specifically.
Okay. I just, I have a building downtown and it's in a flood zone and, it's getting quite expensive to insure the building. And I just, with the forecasts that are out there, are we putting that into the cost of what we are?
And that's what Sandrine is referring to when she says we have to look 100 years out. And so that's the standard that we're looking at when we're forecasting kind of what's being predicted. And that's when she mentioned the FEMA floodplain.
So every building, we have to build to that 100-year floodplain plus one foot. That is a requirement for public schools.
Yeah, but that's to that point, like you're building it such that it could be an island. You're not building it that could be a useful. So there are going to be known, if you look at the cost of ownership, there are going to be known having to buttress walls and figure out how to build this in. So again, this is why I've been requesting since the day one to join the CBOC that we actually do a cost estimate of Edna, because what you look at is you actually look at your upfront CapEx and you look at your cost of ownership. That's the way anybody makes an infrastructure investment. And that is still missing from any of the data that anybody's put forward.
Can I just ask the conclusion on Edna? It's a fabulous property. My kids went there for summer school. The displacing of the students could be absorbed, you said, maybe in 2 of the schools and I see people huffing and puffing. I'm sorry, but I'm just kind of curious. Is it dead in the water for Edna or is it?
At this point, the board, I'll let Superintendent Kaufman.
The board also decided before you had an estimate of what the
Right.
site was.
Chris.
That's the problem.
Chris,
So the board decided, and my understanding of CBOC is that when the board makes a decision, it's an after action review role in more ways than a project design role. So I think we may be a little bit outside of our scope. I don't know. I have to defer to Chairman Peters, but when the board makes a decision, we are allowed to execute it. The oversight function is really whether or not we're expending within the parameters of the bond fund. Am I correct?
well, it is whether the bonds are authorized for a particular use. We don't look at the priority that the school sets or the plan that the school sets. But I think we are getting to questions that the citizens are asking. Some of this, I think, has been already gone over. And I think probably the long-term issue, from what I understand, the board has considered that and made a decision that that particular site is not the way that they're going to go. So we don't have
The school, your board, not this committee.
this committee. That's right.
Okay, and we don't have any say in that.
Well, to the extent that we're looking at cost-effective use of the proceeds, I suppose you can stretch it any which way you want, but the fundamental decision as to whether it was going to be at Edna or whether it was going to be at the Friendfield site or whether it was going to be at this site is up to the board.
Right. And I think I can't remember specifically when we brought that forward, but I do believe there was a cost analysis done. I've seen so many iterations of presentations that are getting prepared versus what's been presented, but we did establish that that was the most costly option in our own internal research. And as such, we recommend to the board a different course of action whereby we're handing it off to you to oversee that course of action that we decided.
What's the difference between an internal, I just don't know the mechanics, how it works here. And I understand we go out to a couple different architects and stuff to have them a request for proposal. And then now I'm hearing something new that you can do internal cost
No.
analysis.
What I'm saying is I'm not sure when I believe we presented the analysis. I don't remember when, but I also don't want to go on the record saying we absolutely presented. I can, I know we've looked at these. I believe we presented it probably at our November, December meeting. But again, we came here to speak to Mill Valley Middle School project tonight, so we don't have that information necessarily in front of us to recall or to bring up at the moment. So that's where we're just going on recall. We're not trying to be evasive,
No,
but
I mean,
I don't
Dr.
wanna
Kaufman,
recall.
just, I know for a record, the EdNo numbers were never presented to the public. And I think that's why it continues to be confusing to folks as to what the cost benefit trade-offs are, both from an upfront CapEx and an ongoing ownership basis. I think the other thing, we have a municipal bond expert on our hands here. Like, I think the other thing that's creating a lot of pressure on this, what was mentioned before, is that we have to expend the bond fund since 2027. All I wanted to pose on that is, I'm sure those bond funds can be reauthorized and extended if they needed to be, to prudently make the right decision. Because there's been a lot of different proposals thrown out over a couple of months and everybody's rushing at something. I think it is prudent to make sure, if you can extend it, what would that process look like?
I think our jurisdiction is not on how they might refinance that. It's, the bonds have been issued and the authorization exists. So it might come to us at some point, but not tonight. Yeah. Michael.
Back to general questions on this item. And as the new member, I'm sure this is in the recent record. It's just one question, so I apologize in advance if it was. So noting the site of the middle school has been in flux, just in the last week. What, in your timeline, what's the current estimate for when the GMP would be known, and when, or prior to that, when the final design of the middle school would be known?
So the GMP and the final design would essentially coincide, which would be at the end of construction document permitting, which we're anticipating a year from now. But one thing to remember too is that from, let's say, now until then, during each phase, we will be updating estimates based on the progress of the design. So it will be more and more refined. And at each phase, the Board of Trustees will need to approve moving forward with the next phase based on the design and the updated schedule and estimate.
So just to confirm, that's like March 1st of next year. You said 1 year from now?
I have the schedule in the next
Okay.
presentation.
Just to conclude, the only thing I wanted to highlight is I think we want to be sensitive to the fact that these portables we're talking about, there will be teachers and students in them in potentially 6 months. And I'd ask, in kind of your experience developing schools, is that a normal timeline for final design and cost to be known after?
So there are two pieces, right? I was mostly talking about the design of the new school. There is also the design of the interim housing project. So there's technically two projects, right? We're gonna move forward with the interim housing because we need interim housing because the site has been selected. This will go faster than the design of the new school. If we can find the schedule, it might be helpful to look at it. But essentially, and to kind of reiterate what Joy was saying, right now the schedule, how we build the schedule, we're trying to align the construction with the school year too. So ideally, we want to finish the interim housing during the summer. So when everybody comes back, they move in the interim housing, right? So right now we're looking at everybody moving in the temporary housing by the beginning of the school year 25-26. So in the fall of 25. So we're trying to align the schedule like this. If we need to push a month or two, we won't align anymore. I'm not saying it's not feasible. It's just not as practical to move in the middle of the year. Same goes for the main construction. We're trying to align with beginning of summer and end of summer, so it's less disruptive. But it's not impossible to not do this.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
A question that I suspect a lot of the folks who are listening in would like to hear an answer to, and that is we've refocused on the middle school and the two options that are being considered are both new construction at the middle school. So can you comment on the relative cost differentials if you were to somehow remodel in some part the existing facility?
Sure. And again, we covered that in a lot of the community meetings because those are questions that come up a lot. And in the last few board meetings, but essentially the answer is the state looks at how much we're spending money on renovating something. And the moment we reach 50% of the value of replacing the building, this triggers additional requirements. We would have to bring the structural system, the fire life safety system, all ADA, everything up to current code. And adding that up, essentially, in our opinion, equates almost the same cost as rebuilding a new building. So our recommendation is based on this because we know that we will reach that 50% replacement cost and trigger all the structural, fire life safety, et cetera, requirements. But also the existing building is below the floodplain requirement. So we would have to also raise the building or abandon part of the building. And when we're looking also at the program and the educational goal, the 21st century learning, it becomes a little more difficult to fit into an existing shell, right? So all this put together, we think that renovating, modernizing the existing building would essentially cost the same as building a new building.
So are you saying that the new building would be higher than this existing building would be?
Yes, this building is currently below the 100-year floodplain. Therefore, it would need to be raised, or some areas of the building would need to be abandoned. The only building on site that is above the floodplain is the multipurpose,
The gym.
the gym.
Okay. And if you were to remodel or rehabilitate this existing school, I guess you're saying you can't do that because of the floodplain. Is that right?
You could, but you would need to raise the building. So it would be above floodplain in addition to upgrading all the structural system and fire life safety system, et cetera.
That was going to be my question is there's no difference. If you remodel the existing building, you're still going to have to essentially go into the cap that is currently there now.
Yes.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you. Other questions?
I know we're not supposed to comment on design, but I think if it's equal to renovate or to rebuild, I would think remodel reuse is the trend of construction because you have less carbon footprint. You are using less new material. You are protecting the embodied carbon in the existing building. I would suggest consider the sustainable factors that if it's equal construction cost, maybe look at the renovate, remodel option more carefully.
Any other questions? Okay, at this point, thank you. Okay. I'm opening and for public comment on this item. First in the room here. And then on. Yes, come forward. No, you have 3 minutes.
I actually have a couple kids who are probably in these halls today, so I am very concerned about what's happening here. There we go.
Yeah. you
Um,
have a timer.
Anyway, so I'm very, very concerned about what we do here. I'm very, very concerned about wasting money, especially wasting taxpayer dollars. I spoke a couple nights. I think I saw a couple people here. I know I really do appreciate what the board has to do. I know it's a tough decision, and I do think we're really, really rushing towards a March 7th decision. When I originally read the measure, the ballot measure, I had no idea that there was anything close to being contemplated as to what we're doing here in Measure G. If you read the Measure G, there's no way you could imply or believe that they were going to tear down the middle school. And even when you actually get the bond measure, which took me 4 days to get from the TAM school district, there's nothing in there. And I know this is your role, is to make sure that the dollars are being spent wisely, but there's nothing in that bond measure that says anything. Well, there's 2 sentences that say contemplate kind of doing some renovations at the middle school. It's like a bullet point under subsection 1. But in that whole bond measure, there's nothing about going through a CEQA analysis, nothing about temporary housing, nothing about going through lawsuits, mitigating environmental hazards, going into landfills, and there's nothing about this lease back arrangement that's being contemplated with the contractor. None of that's in there. So I hope that that's something you guys take up as your board. I spoke a couple nights ago. I really do think, first thing I did in grad school is I took a financial engineering class, and the first thing we looked for is a discounted cash flow model, a fair market value analysis of different capital improvements. And I really think that we should take a look at that for Edna. The demographics are changing. I just registered my kid for high school. There was 400 kids, and normally last year they had 350. And they had 300 this year. I mean, it's going down 15 years and 12, 15 years from now. There's no reason you couldn't put a temporary solution over at Edna while you tear this site down. You don't have to do any temporary housing. You save a hell of a lot of money. And you might even find that you might save $100 million because you find out there's not enough kids in the district to even support another school. I guess the last thing I'd say is I saw the schedule that just showed up. I know we're rushing to a March 7th date, and we want to put up $20 million for temp housing. I don't think that's realistic. I don't think a shovel is going to go on the ground for 3 years. They haven't done any. I'm in real estate. They haven't done any of their analysis on the new site. You wouldn't put up temp housing until you have a solid plan for what you're going to do here. You don't want to put temp housing up. When you do put the temp housing up, if you do the temp housing, you want to be ready on day 1 to start tearing this building down. And I don't think they're anywhere close to being ready for that. There's CEQA issues, there's environmental issues, there's lawsuits. I'm not a proponent of lawsuits, but I know they're coming. Somebody's going to challenge the project. So I hope we don't rush to a March 7th date next week, or I guess, yeah, next week, and take our time and do this right. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Would you identify yourself, please? Excuse me, would you identify yourself?
My name is Eric Halterman.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
Okay. Doug Nelson, you can speak now.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Yeah, I'm going to bring up, well, I'm glad the CBUC members have actually already brought it up, but I am going to bring up the idea of rehabilitation. And as I look at the presentation materials, sustainability is really one of the biggest concerns. And as has been mentioned, from a sustainability standpoint, rehabilitation is, far and just far exceeds the sustainability of new construction. And I know that everybody, wants a shiny new building, but the other thing I heard today is that you love the pod design and you're going to recreate that. So to some degree, you're recreating a wheel here. So, what would a district do that didn't have $194 million? What would they do? Or what would a district do that had $194 million and spread it evenly between the middle school and the elementary schools? What would you do? You would come up with a project that fits your budget. And I think rehabilitation, I know that the back of the envelope analysis says that it's going to be the same price, but I think more work really has to be done. But the benefits are true sustainability, less site work, and I know that there's a lot of concern about soil disturbance and toxic soils and everything. So minimizing soil disturbance is really a big deal. So any potential savings, and I know that I've heard there isn't any, but I just kind of challenge that. But any potential savings could go to elementary school projects. And finally, and I know that I've heard this question come up before also, but the idea of a phased project, a phased rehabilitation of the existing structure, especially with declining enrollment, is there any possibility of doing a phased rehabilitation that does not require temporary housing? So that's my pitch. I know that, this may be beating a dead horse. I know that this has come up before, but I'm glad that the CBOC is asking the same questions, and I just bring that up again, but thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments?
I just have one other question.
So let's bring it back to
Oh,
discussion.
Oh, discussion time. Okay. I'm just a little surprised that we're at this point, and it seems like there's a lot of unresolved items there. We're asking to spend a lot of money, and we've made some commitments, and I appreciate what the school board said, that, they have kind of final say with a lot of things. So I don't know where our boundaries are, but it's hard for me to understand how we could be responsible to the taxpayers and also to this bond underwriting when there's a lot of unknowns out there. And I've told people, and I was happy that I was serving on this board. They said, "Oh, great, you get to deal with the sewer and all this other smell." I said, "Well, I didn't even know about all those things." And so I'm just surprised that there isn't something else that's really been out there, or that at least we've answered a lot of these questions before we're ready to start spending money. What does happen? So we've committed to a $20 million and we're paying interest on that now. We're allowed to spend so much of that for certain phases, and I'd have to pay attention to my notes about those funds. But what happens if there isn't a decision, and let's just say Edna, because it's out of a flood zone, is a better idea because of more time? Or is there, what's the rush, I guess?
I would say that's not a decision for us.
It's not our
make.
decision.
Yeah. We're looking at I suppose the issue in part is whether this committee has the authority to say anything about what the school district is going to do in advance of what they do. That's one issue.
Well, it's spending money, and it just seems like the spending money part doesn't make sense yet to me.
So these questions have been raised numerous times, and I would expect that the board will be addressing that when they make their decision on March 8th. I think what this committee has done in the last hour or so is ask some questions that the committee has been asking, that the public has been asking, as to whether or not this falls within the bond authorization. That's going to be dealt with in the next segment. And I think that will respond to the questions
Roger,
earlier.
the only thing I want to go on the record of saying is you can look up CBOC authority, and a CBOC does have the right to go and say that bonds are being spent imprudently. And that is the only, you don't have the decision of saying like, can you spend it or not spend it? But if it's being spent imprudently, that is upon the CBOC.
Well, that's an opinion on your part, I suppose. No,
No,
we're
that's
not gonna
actually
get-
me researching CBOCs, and they regularly will get into, hey, we need to actually go and have the district pay for an attorney. You saw this in the letters that we've seen. We need to pay for an attorney and understand if these decisions are being rushed because bond funds are being spent imprudently. So I'm an alternate, but I do want to go on the record of saying that is one of the rights and authorities that the CBOC has.
I just wanted, I appreciate that you did a lot of research and said, I was trying to clarify your comment in terms of are you specifically saying that the CBOC has this ability to make this comment saying that it's spent imprudently, which is a fact? Or are you saying that you personally think that this project today, you are saying that they are spending it imprudently? That's why I was trying to clarify the difference.
I think making a decision on March 7th to spend on temp housing versus pumping the brakes for 30 to 60 days is an imprudent expenditure of money.
Other comments? Okay, we're gonna move to the next section then. And this gets to some of the question that was asked. Thank you. Question asked earlier is what is the bond authorization at this point? So I'm going to ask counsel for the district to come forward and address that question.
Good evening, everyone. Closer to that, probably. Yep. Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is William Tunick, attorney with DWK. And just by way of background, so our firm works with school districts all over the state, including bond projects, bond issuance, that type of thing. We were not involved in this bond measure. I've actually just been asked to work with the district on this matter in the last couple of weeks. So we've been able to kind of come in and take a look at this, and I understand both from what I'm hearing tonight, and I think also from the correspondence that you've received and that the district's received in the past, there's questions, sounds like both about, to some extent, about the scope of the purpose of this committee relative to the board and the decisions being made, as well as to ultimately with this committee's authority and what the scope of the measure is. I think those are kind of the two areas that I've heard. So I'm happy to talk about both of those, and if there's questions, answer them. So as far as the scope of sort of the CBOC versus the school board, and it's laid out pretty much in the bylaws, and those bylaws are following what the education code says and what the Ed code section that was enacted after Prop 39, which provides the authority for these types of bonds, says is essentially CBOCs have two authorities. One, which isn't really an issue here, ensure, and well, actually say one primary responsibility, report to the public about the use of district funds, and specifically report whether those funds are being used either for teachers or other operating costs, which are prohibited, and also whether they're being used pursuant, and the Ed code refers you back to Prop 39. What Prop 39 says is you can only use bond funds for certain types of expenditures, essentially facilities, and it also requires a project list in the bond measure. And so when you look at the bylaws, I was taking a look while we were sitting there, what it talks about is the committee is charged with the duty to review expenditure reports produced by the district to evaluate A, if bond proceeds were expended only for the purposes set forth in Measure G, so we'll talk about that in a minute, and B, no bond proceeds have been used for teacher or administrative salaries or other operating expenses. So you can see that the bylaws are essentially mirroring what we have in the education code. And that is in contrast to the bylaws talk about the duties of the superintendent, which are really decisions over approval of contracts, expenditures, project prioritization, project plans, and schedules. And so that's sort of the divide. And I think, you know, if you look back before Prop 39, there was no bond oversight committees, were no project lists. This was the legislature's way of saying, in advance of that election, the district's going to have to tell voters, these are the types of projects that the funds can be used for. Voters, if you approve that, on the backside, we're going to have a committee that then says, okay, district, you spent money on A, B, and C. Let's compare that to what you told the voters in that bond measure you were going to spend it on. And we're going to report back to the public and to the board on whether or not those two things align. And I think that was essentially how the system set up. That's what you have in your bylaws as well. And so to that point, I think then that brings the question, of course, what is Measure G, or what is a bond measure authorize, right? And in looking at that, and from our perspective, the way we come at these is how do courts determine what is authorized by a bond measure and what isn't? And what the courts have said in these cases, there's probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 of them that are out there, is that they will look at, they see the bond measure almost as a contract between the voters and the district. And they've talked about the different parts of that measure, the different parts of that contract. One is the statutes. So what's the power of the district to authorize bond measures? So here in that case, we talked about Prop 39. Second, what does the measure itself, what does the full text of the measure say the district is authorized to spend bond proceeds on? And then, and actually I should take it back, and also the resolution that put that bond measure on the ballot. So usually the measure language is actually attached to a resolution, those two things. And I believe you have all of that. I think that was all attached to what you had today. So the courts will look at those 3 things. Now, in doing so, what the courts have also said about that is they have to assume that voters have read all the materials, including the full text, and have voted intelligently. And I've been in front of judges that have said, we understand whether that's a realistic assumption or not, maybe besides the point, but I think the courts have said we have to make that assumption, because if we don't, we have a very slippery slope, right? So they're going to take a look at it and assume everyone read the text and understood what they read and voted accordingly from a legal perspective. And actually, in looking at that, they've also said, because individuals have come forward, and actually there was a case, one of the cases that we look at a lot is Peralta case that was over Peralta Community College District in the East Bay. And I think back in the 70s, they had a bond on, they had a master plan. They talked about 4 colleges they were going to build in Berkeley, passed the bond, they campaigned on that. It wasn't in the bond measure itself, but they campaigned on it. Afterwards, they talked about it. And then a couple of years later, they decide, you know what, we don't have the money, we don't have the students, we can't do it. And of course, the folks in that area sued them and said, oh, and the folks in that area sued them and said, you told us we were going to have, you campaigned, you knocked on our door, you put it in the arguments, you said we were going to have a college here, now we don't have a college. And the Court of Appeal said, we look at the measure, there's nothing in the measure that says you're going to build a college there. So legally, it's up to the board whether or not they do that or not. And so the courts have not looked as much, or really at all, at the campaign or even the arguments as much as they've focused on that full measure text. So that's really when we come into a question like this, and actually I had another one today from a client, they said, can we do something with bond measure money? The first question we ask is, let's see your full text, and we're going to read it and see what it says. So that's what we look at here. And so if you look at Measure G, it starts by saying there's authorization for projects listed under the bond project list. You look at the bond project list, I think there's 7 categories roughly. The first one of those is talking about the middle school. It has a general heading talking about reconstruction of the middle school. And then I think there's 11 kind of examples of projects that are authorized under there. There's 6 more categories of other types of general projects. And then the bond measure also goes on to say that the kind of the connected costs. So I know there was a comment earlier about legal costs, although only some legal costs, I should say. But it goes on to say, you know, incidental costs, which include design, engineering, architect, other professional services, permitting, legal, those types of soft costs in a lot of sense are included within the authorization provided by, and actually I think the temporary housing was actually specifically called out. Temporary facilities, I should say, is also called out as one of those sample projects. So, you know, when you put those together and I think there's some question about how specific do you have to be, and there was a question about that for a few years. Someone sued Foothill De Anza Community College. Apparently the CCDs always get sued on this stuff. And somebody said, you're not being specific enough. And the court said, well, it really wouldn't be practical for school districts to have to list the site and the specific project. I mean, they got down to saying, well, you know, if you said this building is getting a new roof, and then your other building springs, the roof on another building springs a leak, now you can't use the money over there. And to require that level of specificity wouldn't make any sense. So they said, what in that case you had was a list of the types of projects that would be sufficient. Now, I will say, because and you've probably seen it there's at least one case out there where a court said, you know what, you didn't tell the voters. And in that case, it was the San Diego case, what happened was they had put a general list of projects and which said nothing, this was all about stadium lighting, which said nothing about stadium lights. Then they had actually also done specific lists of projects by school site. Again, didn't say anything. There was one at this high school that said, I think it was bleachers, press box, and ADA improvements. And then at the very end, it said, and you can do anything incidental, which might include field lighting. And the court said that was probably too far to go to get to the field lighting piece. Very different situation than obviously what we have here when we talk about the middle school. That's the first thing that is spoke about in the measure. And the other point to that, because I know there's been some questions here, is that bond measures, and I spoke with our folks that do more bond measures, as well as the council that worked with the district on this measure. I don't know that we've seen a bond measure that says this amount of the money goes to this project, this amount goes there. It's a list of projects that are authorized and then indicate, and I think it does at the end of the measure here, that ultimately the prioritization and determining which projects get built and which ones don't for whatever reason may be, is something that's ultimately left to the board to decide. And they have that prerogative, and they really have to if you're going to have a program that goes 5, 10, however many years. So I think putting all of those things together, you know, when this committee is looking at how the board has decided to spend funds and making that review to report to the public if it fits within Prop 39 and the project list, I think the question is, you know, let's look at the full measure, or the full text. Does it say this project fit within the full text? If it does, the answer to that question is yes. And that's sort of how those two pieces fit together. So I probably went on longer than I needed to. I can do that from time to time, but if there are questions, I'm happy to answer.
So how would you apply what you just said to this particular document, the text language, as to the middle school?
Sure. Well, like I said, so if you look, I think it's A3 is the page of the resolution that talks about, that's the project list. So number 1, upgrade modernized classrooms, related school facilities, create modern, I won't read the whole thing, including reconstruction, reconfiguring, and rebuilding of the middle school facilities. So it specifically calls out spending funds on projects at the middle school, including reconstruction, reconfiguring, and rebuilding. It then goes on, I think that third bullet point kind of stresses it again, talking about reconfiguration, reconstruction, including demolition, storage, temporary facilities. And then I believe the last bullet point there too also talks about modernizing, constructing, and upgrading classrooms. And I'd point out also to some of the discussion that's been going on tonight, towards the end, not end, I should say, I think at the bottom of A5, there's a provision also in there that talks about where the district determines that modernization or renovation is more economical or otherwise in the best interest to be taken on as new construction. The bond measure authorizes that as well. So that's to take into account a situation where, again, for whatever reason, the board may determine new construction may make more sense than renovation. And so I guess the short answer to that is the project that I was hearing about tonight seems to fit within that type of project as described in the full ballot text.
So you're saying that for reconfiguration and reconstruction, it's covered by A3, and for new construction, it's covered by the sentence you referred to on A5. Is that correct?
Well, I'd say a little broader than that. I think A5 is, I'd say both. I don't know. So a lot of times in these measures, the word modernization and renovation are sort of used interchangeably. I think modernization is a word that the state uses to talk about certain types of projects versus new construction. I actually think even the words reconstruction, rebuilding, reconfiguring are probably broad enough to encompass new construction in addition to what you might think of as renovation.
And can you tell me how you would interpret the resolution at a board adopted to go ahead with Measure G? And specifically, what impact is there where there's a reference to the facilities master plan?
Yeah, so actually that's I believe in that Peralta case that I mentioned, I think there was actually reference back to the master plan in that case. I believe it was Peralta. And I think the court again said, we're going to go look and see what's authorized by the full text to determine what the contract was with the voters. So I think that, and in this case, I believe to the extent there was a reference back to the facilities master plan, I think that also talked about the various options at the middle school, again, with a large proportion of the funding being used for those. And I think the priority 1 and 2 buckets.
So your position is that the facilities, whether it's rebuilding or reconstructing here at the middle school, is covered by this?
Yes.
Other questions?
I'm sorry, who are you representing? Who are you?
Yeah, who am I? Why am I here? So William Tunick, attorney, represent the district.
The school district.
School district. Sorry, that'd have been helpful information. Yes, school district. In my world, all districts are school districts, but yeah, we represent the school district under the education code. The district is, well, we can always provide assistance, but also is required to provide technical assistance. So I think as part of that, from time to time, we will be asked to come and speak to CBOCs that have questions about bond measure language in this kind of situation. So I'm here to try to help provide that information.
Yeah, I did take the time to read what was in the summary of the ballot as well as the text, and whoo, boy, wow. And I guess my next question is, here we're hearing how we're spending the money. And this is a pretty big deal for Mill Valley. It's a little less than $200 million. And it just seems like there's so many loose ends, and we're looking to make these commitments at this point. What obligation do we have to continue? And is there a speed that we must follow? Or is there, the school board has a responsibility, and I respect that, but it's also in a city, and a lot of these people care. And is there an obligation to be able to all work together and collaborate too? Is there a certain stewardship that's also part of the responsibility of this bond offering?
Yeah, so it was the first part of your question I was going to respond to, and I forgot what it was. But so I mean, to answer your question, at the end of the day, the contract here is between the voters and the entity that they've authorized to issue the bonds and spend the money, which is the district. And I think the board ultimately has the responsibility to make decisions about how to expend those funds. And I know they have and will continue to receive lots of input from the public about which way they should do that. And ultimately that's how that decision gets made.
Can I just ask a question? Because it's been a popular one since day one that I joined the CBOC, and it's this phrase in all CBOC bylaws, essentially, that the proper expenditure of taxpayer money is actually one of the roles of the CBOC. I'm not sure if you're familiar with some of the just case law and like precedent on that, but like I think there's been quite a bit of precedent, because what does that mean? All right, what is my responsibility? And I think one of the things that, at least in my research of this, what that actually means is making sure that there's proper systems and procedure is one of those things. And it's not just looking in the rearview mirror, as was stated before, and did you spend it only for non-teacher salaries? But there has been a good amount of case law where you have to go, and specific to this, like temporary housing question we're bringing up right here, it comes down to, was there a system or a process to make sure that that expenditure was made at the right time? And I feel like, for at least my research, that is a normal question for CBOC members to ask.
So as far as the case law thing, and I haven't seen every case that deals with this, but as far as I'm aware, there's no cases involving CBOCs or citizen bond oversight committees specifically and their authority. What there are cases of is individuals in the community bringing taxpayer actions. But I'd point out, when you look at the education code provisions that came out of Prop 39, there's provisions that deal with CBOCs and this oversight and reporting role. And then there's separate provisions that deal with litigation and taxpayer actions. And they don't, even though they were enacted at the same time, there's nothing in, they seem to separate those two roles between the CBOC and again, the taxpayer piece.
Yeah,
And so-
no, you're right. I didn't phrase it the right way. Case law will be related to the Waste, Fraud and Prevention Act, and CBOC roles and responsibilities typically related to roles, processes, and things like that, just as it's okay and authorized. Because I think every time people ask questions related to, is that money being spent prudently? We immediately say, well, we can't have an opinion on that. But actually it is like, from everything I see, a very normal question asked in a CBOC committee.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, I'd point you back, and I think the chair pointed it out that in looking at the education code, and this is what you've got in your bylaws as well, the questions are generally limited to, did the expenditure fit within Prop 39? Does it fit within Measure G? I think, as the chair pointed out, there's some discussion about review of cost-saving measures that a district may be engaged in, and I think there's 4 or 5 examples of those. I don't know that it goes so far as to say the purview of a CBOC is to, determine whether or not an expenditure is prudent or not. And I'm not sure what standard you'd use for that in any event. And I think ultimately, when it comes to discretionary types of decisions like that, that is what the education code has reserved for the board, who's elected directly by the voters to make those type of discretionary policy decisions.
So in terms of cost-effective measures, if I recall, it referenced including the following. So how broadly do you interpret cost-effective measures?
Yeah, no, I was actually going to look at it. So it does talk about reviewing efforts by the district both districts to maximize bond revenues by implementing cost-saving measures. So I do think, there's probably fair questions about that. But again, the samples it gives are designed to reduce professional fees, cost of site preparation, joint use, incorporating efficiencies in school design, that type of thing. So I think those types of questions, to the extent they're examining things that the district's doing, that they're saying they're doing to maximize bond revenues, probably is fair purview, as opposed to, is this site or is this decision a good decision or not? I think the questions about costs maybe are more within the committee's purview.
I believe our responsibility ultimately is to produce a report
Mhm.
affirming or rejecting the responsible use and the other terms. What are the implications of us actually issuing that report? Does the school board have to listen to it? Kind of, do we just more people making noise? What is the actual process once we've issued that? Either with an affirmative finding or a contradictory finding?
Yeah, so the Ed Code actually does require that the board has to provide a response. And in most districts, what I've seen, and this may be in your bylaws, is that I think it actually is that the CBOC, usually the chair will come and present at a board meeting in public. The report is public and the board needs to respond to any findings that are in there.
Other questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
At this point, since we're here in part because there was a demand filed that we have a CBOC meeting that was in the works in any event. As a chair's prerogative, I have asked the entity that has submitted the demand to provide comments. We'll let public comments after that, but specifically, although the issue of the location has been resolved, so it's not going to be at Friends Field, it's going to be here. I think a fair reading of the demand that was submitted was a question about whether all of the money being spent on the middle school was consistent with the Measure G language. So I'm going to let Mr. Chavez respond to that.
Thank you. Appreciate all your service and willingness to sacrifice your time to be here this evening. My name's Mark Chavez. I'm attorney for Friends of Fields, and I just want to say at the outset about why I'm here tonight. I'm here because you guys are in charge of overseeing the expenditure of $194 million. And as the school district's council just told you, that money is to be spent in accordance with the contract between the school district and the people. And the contract that was made between the people of Mill Valley and the school district was that the money was going to be spent to do repairs and upgrades at 6 schools. And we don't dispute at all the language that exists in the bond measure relating to reconstruction of the middle school. It's there. We're not disputing that. Our problem is that there's only $194 million. And if you look at the budget that's been adopted by the school district, what it shows you is that the only way there's going to be any money available for the elementary schools is if they do a remodel of this school rather than do a new construction. The budget that was just adopted, I believe on February 8th, shows $130 million in hard cost, $60 million in soft cost, but the discussion that's occurred among the trustees has indicated that that soft cost number is not capped, is likely to go higher. And in fact, the trustees said it's going to be a $194 million plus project. They also said that there was no money left for the elementary schools. So the question is, what is the implication of that for you? How does that trigger your responsibilities, and how does that relate to your authority? And it's, I think, a very simple thing, and that is that your duties and your responsibilities are statutory. They aren't governed by your bylaws. The bylaws are promulgated by school districts. And the reason they promulgate those bylaws is to effectively cabin the exercise of your oversight. But it is the statutory provisions that govern what your responsibilities are. And what they say is that you're charged with verifying Would you please give me a couple more minutes in light of the extended discussion that the school district
I will
council?
give you 2 minutes more.
Okay, thank you. You're charged with verifying whether or not the expenditures rather, were for the proper purposes. And here, those purposes were to do the work at 6 schools. The problem is that that's not going to occur. You have the right to call that out. You have a responsibility to issue a report to the public in the event that you detect improper use of the funds. And again, what the problem is that there just is not enough money. And I would ask you all to each look at Education Code 15278B, which spells out your responsibilities. This isn't just a question of you checking the boxes. This is a question of you being responsible in your oversight of the school district and making sure the funds are used for the proper purposes that are spelled out in the contract between the people and the school district. And again, go back and look at the language that exists in the bond and what it talks about repeatedly, both in the bond question and in the text of the bond measure. And we went through this extensively in our submission. It talks about schools, plural. It talks about doing the repairs and upgrades that are reportedly necessary at all of these schools. And the situation we're in now is that all of the money is going to be diverted to the middle school project. They've included state money in the budget. But that's not your charge. That's not what's relevant here. It's the bond money. Where is the bond money going? And is the bond money going to be spent on the purposes that were outlined to the public? Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, we'll open it up to any other public comment at this point.
Just a quick question. I'm sorry. What was your name again, sir, who just spoke, and what was your relationship to this cause? I'm sorry.
My name is Mark Chavez. I'm the lawyer for Friends of Fields that filed the demand that triggered this meeting.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
My name is Karsten Anderson. I'm on the board of the Coalition of Sensible Taxpayers in Marin, called COST. Yeah, I'm here because I think there is a fundamental question about the use of the money. It's not the amount of the money that we're so interested in. It is the fact that when the Measure G was sent out to the taxpayers, there was a representation that this was going to be spread, as Mr. Chavez said, on several schools. And now it's drastically changed and it's going to be on one school. That's fundamentally different, even though, according to the attorney, it's covered here and there and so forth. But that's really not what the public at large, when this was sold to them, were told. That's our problem with the current situation. So that's something for the committee here to take a look at and to see if that's really allowed, in your opinion, and make a recommendation. Our opinion is that it's certainly borderline at best. And we hope that can be rectified, because it also has implications on future bond measures. If it turns out that the people in Mill Valley in general thinks that this was the wrong way to go about it, maybe you'll have problems with future bond measures. Anyway, thanks for my time.
Thank you.
Any other public comments? Right, in light of Mr. Chavez's comments, I'd like to give the district's council an opportunity to respond.
I didn't ask if you wanted me to sit here or stand up there, but
It's fine.
it's okay. Thank you. Yeah, I'll just go quickly because I know I did speak for a while before. So I do think one thing, as far as the factual information around the plan, I think there's a little bit more of that coming up this evening in the next presentation. So I don't want to go into how much money is going where. I think there's actually agreement here probably as far as the role of this committee is to determine or to report to the public if there's improper use. I think it's then the question of what does improper mean? And I think that's clearly where you're hearing the difference. Ultimately, again, what we've talked about is at the end of the day, if you end up in front of a court, what a court's going to look at is what's in that full text and not, and I don't think there's anything in that full text that's limiting. The question is it authorized by that full text? And we've talked about that. The only other thing I'd mention, and this is something that may or may not be helpful, but just to raise it, as far as the ballot label and the 75 words that voters see when they vote. So over the years, the legislature has added more and more requirements as to the information that has to be in that 75 words. So really what districts get to decide to put in there is closer to probably about 30 words at this point. The second half of that is almost all required by law at this point. So what districts are trying to do is give, in the most general terms, really a sense of what the money may be used for, because I think you don't want to end up in the opposite situation where you say to improve the middle school and then the full text says funds for all sites, and then someone comes in at the back end of that and says, well, the 75 words said you only mentioned the middle school and you used the money somewhere else. Why didn't you tell us that that was a possibility as well? So it's tricky to be very precise in those 75 words, which is, I think, why the courts ultimately look at the full text. And I don't know that there's really a question here that full text does authorize this the middle school project. So I'll leave it at that unless there's anything else.
When was that change, or when was that?
You mean as far as the additional requirements?
Yes.
They change it on us every couple of years. So,
And so it was after this was voted for?
oh, no, I'm trying to think. No, you mean as far as the requirements for the 75 words?
Well, no, I know about the 75
Yeah.
words, but the way it is written, or
Oh.
that it's more.
So I'd have to go back. Certain parts, probably about 10 or 15 words have always been required since Prop 39 existed. I think, I want to say about 2 years ago, they added some additional requirements. It would have been before this. So when you see the reference to the interest rate, to the tax rate, to oversight, to audits, the name of the school district, all of them out of the bonds, obviously, all of that part of the 75 words is what's required to be put in there under the ed code. It's usually just that first line or two that you're seeing that is really where there's any real discretion on the district to try to explain to the voters quickly what the general purpose is.
Yeah. It's interesting to me. I'd love to hear your comment on this, how, I don't know, I saw 200 people from our community who I seem to believe are stewards of our community, kind of shocked. And, I find a lot of these people really smart and intelligent. What do you say to that, to a community? I mean, I guess we're not accountable. We just got to worry about how the money's being spent, but.
Yeah. Yeah, I no, and I understand the question, which is there's a legal question, right? Which is, and ultimately I think the purview really of the committee is this a proper expenditure under law? And so for that, we look at the full text. I think there's a question when it comes to boards with all types of discretionary questions and policy decisions. At the end of the day, is this something the community supports, right? And those could be the same answer, and sometimes they're different answers, but that ultimately falls to the board to decide if, based on everything that they're hearing and the information they have, this is the decision they want to make. And then as long as it's authorized by law under the ballot measure or the bond measure, they're allowed to do so.
Just one other question. The gentleman who spoke earlier about Friends Field, he talked about this statute, this provision and so forth, and the bylaws. Well, how wishy-washy are the bylaws compared to the?
Well, I think the bylaws actually, I could be wrong. I think the bylaws cross-reference Prop 39 and the education code requirements and sort of incorporate them. So to the most part, I mean, I have to take a real close look. They usually track. And I don't think that any district would take the position that the scope of the committee could be limited by the bylaws, when the fact that you've got the education code out there, that obviously is going to trump bylaws in any respect.
Okay, so the statute is worthy of our board to read and understand?
Yeah, and I think that was the one that I referenced, 15-78, and that's the one that talks about as oversight, ensuring the bond revenues only described for the purposes in Prop 39, and then the teacher and administrative salaries are in there as well. So that you see it in the bylaws and in the ed code.
So we understand that in terms of our.
Yeah, no, we understand, but look, I think my main point is Mr. Chavez is making points that we have some, duties here. They're complicated. It shouldn't be on our head to try and interpret all of this. We do have a right to request an independent legal counsel for the CBOC. And so, Mr. Peters, I've just, motion that you consider whether, with the complexity involved in this bond measure and where we're not just today, but where we're going forward, we don't need to be reliant on district attorney. We don't need to be reliant on other attorneys coming up here and telling us we need to do one thing or another. It may be a low cost, easy way for us to not trying to be parse legal language on where our authority is and not to just adopt an independent legal counsel and be done with it.
Okay, I mean, I understand that position. I have questions. I don't have questions for you. I guess we're probably bringing it back to a discussion here at this point. Thank you. Let me start off. I see the question before us is whether the bond authorization authorizes the expenditures of, in essence, all monies for the middle school. as I heard the earlier presentation, the bond monies are going to go in part set aside for the other elementary schools. So there's a factual issue about whether the characterization that it's all going to be spent on the middle school is correct. As far as the bond measure language and the resolution, because I think I understood that the resolution is something that would be considered. And I point out that for purposes at least of referencing the facility master plan, and that's why I had included in this agenda packet the facility master plan. If you look at, I think it's page 104 of that plan, it shows the various priorities and it shows how much is going to be expended. The vast majority of the amount reflected on page 104 is going to be spent on the middle school. So to me, at least from the perspective of what was included within the bond, the full bond language with references to middle school, on the face of it, it seems to be that that's consistent. It seems also, though, that as I read that language on a narrow perspective, the page A3 referred to rebuilding and reallocation modernization, and it's over on page A5 that the new construction is referenced. And that allows a new construction if the school district comes to the conclusion that's economically sensible and in the best interest of the district. So I would be looking for the school board on its next meeting as it takes this up to at least have some conclusion as to the whether it's economically advantageous and whether it's in the best interest of the school district. If it meets that standard, then I think it falls within the bond language. That's my perspective as I sit here today. And I'm happy to.
I'd just like to add a comment. I mean, I think it's, there's some discussion of the bond language, and it seems pretty cut and dry relative to some of the things that were expressed tonight. The next to last paragraph says, approval of the district's bond measure does not guarantee that all of the identified projects within this bond list will be funded beyond what can be completed with funds generated by this bond measure. There are many reasons why that could happen, one of which is inflation, and that's happening to almost every public works project in the United States and probably the world. So I think everyone in this room and listening would agree it would be fantastic to improve every single campus we have. But I think there is a reality here. And to me, it's very clear that there was not a promise in this bond measure that a certain number of projects will be completed. It says the best would be done with the money that's available in the budget at the time.
Other comments? Hearing none, I suggest what we do is table this issue and wait to see what the school board does with respect to addressing the questions that we've raised, and take that up as necessary at the next meeting or as necessary sooner.
I just wanted to comment, Michael brings up a good point. Okay. The text of the bond basically says that, okay, we can just spend it on one project and adios to all the other ones. But we still have to make sure that money is being spent well. And my earlier conversations or comments were, I'm surprised we don't have more information before we're making some of these commitments. Isn't that one of our responsibilities? And so, yes, maybe it is, go ahead and spend all this money. But wow, there's a lot of unknowns still. And I would think that, if we're getting ready to start making these decisions, we'd have a lot of these answered already. So I guess I'd like to have a discussion with our committee about that. am I wrong with my assumption here, or is?
Well, what would you like to see at this point?
I think one of the items I'd like to see is how much more was Edna? One of the items I saw on there was they had certain amount of money allocated for Edna in terms of improvements. Well, if Edna is not going to need the improvements, can that money go towards the rebuilding of the project there? I don't know. The smell of the sewer and the flood, and we got a moat here, and kids will be boating to school. Yeah, I'm exaggerating, yes, but wow, and we're about ready to spend this $15 million. Okay,
Yeah,
please.
yeah. I feel there's item on D3, other schools projects. It's not presented yet.
Okay.
Okay, can you come up and do D3? Thank you for moving it along.
Right, so a few information we typically bring to this board is update on the schedule and what has happened since we last met. And we actually had prepared that in December, so I updated some of the information. But also, one thing that was asked was to review expenditure to date as far as Measure G. And also there were questions about defining a little bit more the roles of each individual or entity we're referring to during our meeting. So I'm going to go over that. We can go next. So that's the schedule we were looking at earlier. Essentially, this schedule has remained the same since, I want to say, May of last year. This was the recommended schedule for the entire Measure G Priority 1 projects. That includes the middle school project as well as all the modernizations. We are currently still following the schedule. The schedule shows that the middle school is essentially the critical path because it is the largest and the longest project. We had accounted at the time for temporary housing in case we needed it, so that we would track against that schedule too for decisions. And then for modernizations, we recommended essentially doing 2 schools every year. And at the end, the priority was based on how old or how needed those improvements were. So Edna is the most recent facility, so we kept it last. And Tem and Strawberry were on top of the list as far as needing improvements. When it comes to the middle school project, again, that's more just focused on the middle school itself. We had questions, a lot of questions related to the agency process. And typically, and I think that's going to answer some of your question about answering some questions. Typically on public school projects, we would go, the agency process would be parallel to the design process. Sure, we could go through CEQA, we could do all the testing, we could get all the reporting and then start design. However, that would delay, that would be a significant delay in starting design and construction, which means additional costs. So typically, agency processes are ran in parallel with design. And that's fairly typical on public school projects. So in this case, I'm not listing all of them. The main one obviously is going to be CEQA. That's going to include hazmat, environmental. We're going to have to go through CGS for geological testing. DSA is our main agency, it's the division of the state architect. It's the main agency giving us a permit, and many other ones. BCDC has been discussed lately too. So right now we are tracking on that schedule. Some questions were asked about defining a little bit more what each party does. So I wanted to give the board these definitions, and we essentially divided them in three categories. The parties that are part of the design, then building the project, and I believe the third category are agencies. And again, this is not a full list, but just wanted to give you the main one at this point. Also, I mentioned earlier, we had three steering committee meetings, and Julio went over who is the steering committee, which just wanted to give you also an overview of the purpose of the steering committee. And we wanted to emphasize also that this committee does not make decisions. It informs the board on preferences and on design. So as Julio mentioned, we have quite a few people. I think you forgot. We also have a trustee as part of the steering committee. Wanted to give you an update also on the modernization projects and the middle school. Essentially what we have been doing with the architect, the engineers, the contractors, the communication consultant, surveying firm, state funding, and also what's coming up. So there's been a lot of activities on all projects, including modernizations. As I mentioned earlier, we started working on Tam and Strawberry back in September. And we will continue to move forward with these two projects and then engage the next group to start the next two modernizations for the elementary schools. Yeah. So going back to the question about funding, and that's for some of you, that's not new, but might be new for some of you. So when I was talking about financing and lease back and how over the last year we essentially came to this point with, okay, we need some sort of financing, some sort of bridge financing. It's not just because of the estimates for the middle school, but it's essentially based on the bond series sales. Essentially, we have a cash flow problem. And so the bars you're seeing there in yellow are the scheduled, or it's the schedule of bond sales. So we don't have a problem really through Series A. We don't really have a problem through the beginning of Series B. We have a problem when the middle school construction starts because expenditure just skyrockets because the construction cost, the hard cost expenditure is much larger than soft cost expenditure. That being said, next one, please. So to go back to I was saying we are working on the modernizations, and I mentioned earlier that, and I will clarify this again at the next board meeting next week, because I think there is a misunderstanding on the modernizations and what funds are being used. It will be very clear next week. A very simple graphic that will explain it. But essentially, we have been working on the modernizations. We will continue to move forward with the modernizations. The funding and the financing component will be part of the middle school. And just wanted to give you an overview to date and what we're projecting through Series A that we're going to spend on all projects across the board.
Okay, questions?
might not be the appropriate question, but the only one I have is on this deadline we've been talking about on the 2027 of the bonds being expended. If we were delayed in the overall construction schedule, and when you look at that bar chart of where the expenditures are coming out, would there be a way, if we were delayed and we're, let's say, delayed a year at the extreme, to just, I don't know what the bond requirements are on expenditure, but similarly with this structure of the lease back, couldn't you go and put capital in an escrow or something else and still meet the requirement and then pull it out of that over time? I'm trying to think the reverse, where you have a cash flow problem like this. What if you have a cash flow problem in the opposite way, where we got to get the money out the door? Have you ever seen that in any of the school financing schemes, where you can get the money out the door and then the capital time on the ground comes out afterwards to still meet the bond funding requirement?
You're asking-
we wouldn't want to go give all the subcontractors and everybody else something up front, but is there a way where in reverse, we can meet the bond expenditure requirement, but then have the dollars to the subcontractors and everybody else go out the door later?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. That being said, I want to mention something, that when we came up with this and realized there was a cash flow problem, we did look at, regardless of the 5 years to 2027, we did look at scenarios where we're like, what if our biggest expenditure is the middle school. What if we delayed it 3 years, knowing it would be $7 million a year more? Could we make it work? Like, it's a cash flow. Can we wait until we get the money in the bank to do the project? The answer was you would have to wait 10 years before you could do that project, or it was like a really long delay. We looked at many different scenarios, and this is not the most up to date, but we're working right now on refining, right? How we can make that fit within that 5-year period. The advantage of the 5-year too is, as you know, time is money, right? The more we wait, the more, the less we're getting out of the money we get. And I would say that's kind of the idea behind utilizing state funding that might arrive in the mail, 4 or 5 years down the road. But expending that money now, you're essentially spending dollars today that might be worth less later, right?
Yeah.
So that's the idea, getting more now rather than
Totally
later.
get it. The only thing I know is for certain is that bar chart's not going to happen the way the bar chart is laid out. I've done enough construction over 20 years to know that doesn't happen. So what is the contingency if everything does shift out for 12 months? How do we deal with that when it comes up? When we come back and we say, hey, we got a CEQA EIR process that's going on an extra 6 or 8 months. How do we figure that out from a budget and from an actual bond requirement standpoint?
I'll let you know when we cross that bridge and we have that problem. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that's the right answer in construction planning. We have to know what the contingency is if we're basically, if it is a known fact that most projects get delayed in some sort, right? I mean, and we're sitting where we are today, it was brought up by public comment. I think we have to plan ahead for how do we deal with that. Hopefully it's not just a massive downscoping of the project, but some way we need to think through, like if everything gets shifted to the right by 8 months, what happens then? Does the whole house of cards explode, or what happens?
What's specifically your question?
What's the contingency if things get shifted that are outside of our control from a permitting and everything else process? If inflation has to get baked in, and if we have this exploding deadline of a 2027.
Okay, so right now the budget includes allowances, contingencies, because we are at a conceptual design level, right? So there is room in the budget for unknowns. Just like I mentioned earlier, there's $7.5 million in mitigation allowance, right? Maybe we'll have to spend 7.5, maybe we won't. And maybe that if we save money on this, it can be reallocated to something. Again, I want to emphasize, and I say it every time, things move, right? As you know, you do, you seem experienced in doing budgets, and things will move, right? The numbers will not look the same every day. And there are contingencies for, like, if, for example, I'm just going to give an example on the modernization, if one project costs more than and another one comes in less, we're gonna shift those funds right across. So we have contingencies built in those estimates to a certain extent, of course.
And I just want to add to that, I think part of whether we're doing it's our environmental planning or whether it's building out the budget and building out our schedule, one of the things is we're looking at informed decision, whether that be the data, that historical data that we have with Flint, the general contractor, as well as Lionakis, as well as AECOM. Part of what we wanted to do with the lease back is to get everybody, the benefit of that construction method is to get everybody on the front end. And so when you're making these decisions, it's not just the architect, it's not just a construction manager, it's also having the general contractor in the room. So it's three folks looking at the, having back end finances, looking at it and having their each expertise of what they're bringing to the table from the industry. And so that's the same thing. I know your question wasn't about environmental, but it's the same approach we've been taking around that is, what is the data? What's the historical information we have on the site? Going to the state agents, getting their opinion based off that information, hiring a consultant, getting their opinion. And that's how we're continuing to make these decisions is based off the data we have, based off the expertise in the room, and we're having multiple voices weigh in as we move forward.
Other questions?
Yeah. Not real question. It's observation. The temporary classroom will start in December this year. I'm just wondering if it's a good idea to start construction in December, if it's as wet as this year.
I have started projects in the fall, but if it is a concern, we can look at it.
Well, I think if you can just kind of give your rationale of the timeline of what we think it's going to take and why December was the date.
Yeah, essentially, like I mentioned earlier, we're trying to get the interim housing in place so that when students come back after the summer of 2025, they can move directly into the temporary housing. They don't have to move again, right? So the idea, looking at that end date, at the target of August 2025, how long would it take for construction? How long would it take for permitting? How long would it take for design? Hence the March 2024 deadline, essentially. If we need to move it, we will. This is how we were looking at the schedule and trying to align with the school year.
And is there any cushion in your current date?
Originally, we were asking for a decision in February. So we're months behind. We still feel comfortable. We can still meet that schedule. The more we wait, the more difficult it's going to get, especially the challenge is going to be to secure portables, especially that many, get them procured, and also going through the state with the design.
So just a question on the portables. Were any other alternative locations looked at, like Edna or otherwise, where they're not sitting right here on the site? Because I feel like there's still a lot to be planned out with traffic flow and everything else and how people are going to access those. And I was at least hoping to see when the decision came out on Friends Field that there could at least be an agreement between the city and school district that we could at least move the portables and take up one baseball diamond instead of sitting them at a construction site.
So I think, Dr. Kaufman, if you can just talk about a little bit, because part of moving the portables to the other side is the decision that the board made around keeping the 6 to 8 model and keeping the middle school experience. So that was one of the rationales that kind of, I think, be helpful to kind of go over that piece.
Yeah, I think the question was, are we thinking about moving the temporary campus to a different location? Not so much the division of classrooms. So the board made a decision to keep the 6 through 8 students together for multiple reasons that I won't go into right now. We did initially inquire about the ability to build into some of the fields, and that was at that time a non-starter. And at this point, we've also done more analyses about what it would cost to pull utilities and move things there. So that adds cost for us, even if we were able to. I think the piece that for me, as superintendent in loco parentis for all of your children, is the fact that the individuals who are going to be doing this construction have to maintain the safety and security of their own employees. And we have a pretty rigorous CEQA process planned, and the abatement will be necessary in order to make sure that the safety standards for the contracting agencies are met. And my understanding, while I don't understand this fully, is that there's a residential standard that we're held to that's different even than a commercial standard. Higher. Way higher. Okay, it's way higher. I know it's different. So, is that gonna reassure everyone? No. We can't buy the property by Safeway. No one, I asked for $27 million about 3 meetings ago. No one's given it to me. So we are where we are, and it costs money to move the fields. I'm sure you've all witnessed what it's been like to consider the use of the fields, and that in conversation began actually with the request to move our portables onto the fields. That is what started the title search. So let's all be clear that we're not building on the fields and that was not initially an offer made to us as an option.
I know you've been dealing with this. I mean, this is an entirely selfish decision, but between the city and the school district to not even contemplate how difficult this is going to be, forget about even toxicity, but for kids to even be able to work through the noise of a demolition project is going to be an unbearable situation here. So I'm hoping that brighter minds, since the decision you guys kind of came to on Tuesday of not being permanent facilities there can kind of prevail here. And I think that's, there's probably a different decision on ordering equipment for these portables that might be being made on March 7th versus the location. So I really hope, and I definitely will be encouraging my friends to continue this discussion with the city on finding a more rational decision than what is currently proposed at site.
Chris, you've had a lot of input. I appreciate that. I think we're a little bit beyond the cost issues that are associated with this committee. So,
yeah, Roger, the only way we're not is if this leads to the same kind of litigation issues that shut down Friends Field. It could very much lead to our starting $15 million expenditure and then coming back and be like, we spent money and now we're dealing with a different public litigation.
and that's a decision that the Board of Trustees has to make. I've granted you quite a bit of license. All right. Any other questions? Thank you very much. So now I will bring it back to.
On this.
Yes.
Sorry. Okay.
I'll be super quick. I know whoever wrote this bond measure was either really good or really bad because they obviously knew what they were doing so that they could create some legal argument to cull together these little pieces for the middle school. One of the things that the lawyer didn't mention, and I hope you have a chance to talk to some other lawyers, is there is some kind of a structured lease back arrangement. And I'm almost 95% sure that that's not included in the bond language. And that's all required for this to work. Some way you lease the property to a contractor and then lease it back. And I don't know what the cash flow implications are for that for the district long term. I went to the meeting on Tuesday. I think it's pretty much a done deal. I don't know who listened to it. They're voting yes on the 7th. I think it's maybe up to you. I don't know if you guys can do this. You have authorization, but to take some kind of a vote to make a recommendation that you want to see more about you want to see more information, and you would make a recommendation tonight that you get more information. You're asking for more information before they make a decision on March 7th. Thanks for your time tonight. Have a good night.
Okay, now I'll bring it back. Anyone want to go? Any comments? Okay, then I'll try and summarize. I think that the issue of the scope of this committee is a fluid one, and I think we're all wrestling with that. And I appreciate that a lot of the questions tonight were on issues that weren't specifically, was it within the bond authorization and so forth. But I think they're relevant and germane to understanding what the overall financial impact is. And I see that the CBOC's responsibility is to look at the finances, look at the situation to see whether the dollars are being spent in a cost-effective manner and for the benefit of the taxpayers who are paying the bond over the time. So although at times I was uncomfortable with some of the discussion and the scope of it, I thought it was helpful and useful. I don't propose that we adopt any resolution tonight that directs the school board to do anything. The issues that have been raised are questions of due diligence on the part of the Board of Trustees. And there are questions and issues I think that they've been hearing about quite a bit. I'm comfortable that this particular proposed use of the funds is within the bond authorization, both because I think the facilities management plan looked at this as one option. The priorities were set by the school board in terms of what they were going to spend dollars. So they've made that kind of decision, subject to subsequent events, of course. But clearly, if you look at the amounts that were designated for the middle school as a priority one issue, it is by far the most money for the bond measure. So as Michael pointed out, nothing was promised for sure on everything. And from what I understood by the testimony today, the activities for the elementary schools are proceeding. So to me, that addresses the question, if there is anyone outstanding, of the adequacy of the bond language and the use of these funds as specific in that. I think we all have questions about how this is going to play out long-term. We're all interested in a full definition of cost efficiency, which brings in a lot of factors. And I think that that's something that we will have occasion to deal with in the months and many months ahead. So I would consider this as information well secured and to be taken into our discussions as this moves forward. With that, I would propose to move to the committee business, but I'm open to other comments.
Can I just ask a couple questions about what
Yeah.
you're proposing? You mentioned something about due diligence. Are you confident about the due diligence that has been done? Sitting here at this meeting, and this is my first one, the cost of this Edna experience. I don't know how many students are at Edna. There's what, 900 here at the middle school? And how many students are at Edna? I mean, I don't know. Was there 300 at Edna? I mean, was there?
Well,
700 at Edna? Okay, so, it's just, we're making temporary housing, here for 900 and, I don't know the Edna, I don't know what the costs were. We talked about this internal cost of Edna not being within the scope, and I'm just hearing how all this is adding up here at this location, and and there's a lot of unknowns still. And yes, I know what happens with construction. It sent me to the funny farm almost. And I don't know what happens after we run out of this money. Do we go to the voters to say, hey, we need more money? Should we, is there something we should say, hey, for 30 days, should we just get some of these concrete answers and be able to revisit? Are there certain, can we identify 5 things that are going to make us all feel comfortable so when we go back to the voters? Because that's who we are responsible to, and be able to say, all right, this is it. Unless this committee feels comfortable with where we are at this point.
So just to address one question you made about Edna. To address your question about Edna, when it was discussed at the.
I'm sorry, who are you? Are you on the committee too?
She's an alternate. on the
Oh, she's an
committee.
alternate. Okay. Hi, Joy.
Hi.
Okay.
And I've been following the process for the last year. So it's what's frustrating, I guess, is that it's frustrating and awesome in the same time. It's frustratingly, it's great for the process of democracy that we have woken up the community to what this project is that people voted for. So I'm really glad to hear that. I'm glad that, as I said the other night, that I'm really glad people have come to appreciate what the community values in Friends Field. And at the same time, we just need to build a middle school that is going to live for the next 50, 75 years and support the children for what the new world is post-pandemic, So one thing that struck me as critical to the sort of superficial understanding of what Edna is versus what maybe we imagine it could be. It was built in 2010 to the standards of the construction standards of 2010 for children that are 3 years old to 10 or 12 years old. The middle school is, of course, supporting children that are 10 to 15 years old. 5 feet tall, 6 feet tall will not fit at, for example, a classroom that was built for 4-year-olds. So things like science labs don't exist in an elementary school. So things like that, I think, are some of the costs that Julio mentioned were build up and don't, and sort of, it seems like a great campus. My children went there. I really, I think it's a beautiful place to be, and I can imagine middle schoolers being there. But in terms of what we have to do, because the other point that I think is, you raised the concern about, you're worried about the kids in the temporary spot, but basically we're building 2 middle schools. We're building this. The term temporary is sort of meaningless and deceptive because we have to build the middle school as if it's at the middle school, and then we have to build the middle school as if it's the middle school twice. So these temporary structures, when we build a house and it goes over, goes over budget or it takes too much long time, it's generally us and the contractor. This has 25 different state agencies reviewing all this process and adding input at every step. So I feel like it's when you say, I don't understand what's happening with these $15 million, they've made they worked for hours and hours and hours on making presentations, and then they presented it, and they're summarizing what they presented in 1 sentence. And then we say, well, that's not enough information. So that's what I've gleaned from the last 2 hours, that a lot of effort has been put into it to make a sensible decisions. And at every point, we have to basically trust that the people that the school board that we elected, the superintendent that we hired, the team that they've put in place, all are making decisions with the input of the community who's been invited to every single meeting for the last year.
Is it trust or hold them accountable? And hold them accountable for the due diligence and the completeness for the spending of this money and to the community members who voted for it. I don't deny that, but I'm asking questions and I'm finding answers that seem a little vague still to me. And I'm sorry, and I'm sorry for not participating, but
Look, I think the point, I think this is not working. I think the point that I want to stress is, Joy, I have been involved in this before Measure G even passed, I think, as you understand, in all the details. And a lot where my frustration comes is despite all the work that has been going on to get us here, the same drum I've been beating since Dr. Berman was the superintendent, since before Measure G was passed, on doing a clear feasibility and cost benefit analysis on one site besides this site never occurred. And that's what leaves me feeling like I don't know the answer, and maybe that was an internal analysis. So my clear request would be that a clear cost benefit analysis, and this could be done without disturbing the kids at Edna. You would go and actually accelerate the expansion, the upgrades on the other elementary schools first. Then the kids in Edna could move into the elementary schools. Then you would go and do a cost of actually upgrading Edna. That's what I've been requesting in black and white writing, multiple letters to the board before this board was the board, and that has never been done.
And is there a reason why?
Can I say something? Just to answer your first question, I have been following the steps as well. I feel the board and the design team has done proper due diligence. I feel comfortable moving forward. Just my answer to the first question.
Okay.
I would say that I am equally comfortable. I'm also comfortable that the issue of Edna is not on the table for us because that was already a decision by the Board of Trustees. As I indicated earlier, I think their obligation is to look at what's economically beneficial and what's in the best interest for the school district. And when they came to the conclusion that the Edna project was not feasible for them, I think that was the end of it. Now, that's a decision that is well beyond what the dollars are spent for. It involves an entirely different part of town that hasn't participated because that's not been on the radar screen. It involves modifying something that was built just a few years ago for a different reason, and we're still paying that off. And as far as the due diligence, I think what I heard is a lot of concern about the unknowns. And I don't know that you can resolve those unknowns. That you can raise with every single project a series of unknowns and say you haven't done your due diligence. The individuals that the school district has hired to assist them have done this many, many times before. It's not their first rodeo by any means. So you may have some particular expertise that you think is applicable, but so far from what I've seen, and I haven't reviewed everything and I haven't been involved to the extent you have, there are some pretty solid reasons why it doesn't make sense to be there. And so the question that we have, I think, is, would there be a cost savings to be there? I don't know how we even get our arms around this at this stage.
Or at least the access to their internal review.
I don't think that fits within what our charge is.
We're spending $15 million on March 7th because this is the chosen pathway, but we've never put a clear cost. I mean, if we're all about transparency and everything else, why not put a cost to it? We are able to put a cost to
Sorry, I
Friends
can't read
Field.
your lips.
We were able to put a cost to Friends Field in a 2-week or 3-week process. I'm sure we could put a cost in a 30-day process to an alternative.
It's not entirely a cost issue. There are other factors. There are transportation issues. There are traffic issues.
Understood. Just like there's other factors in building an island of a school, right? There's other factors in everything. You have to look at the full qualitative and quantitative on both locations.
Right. And all right, I think we're going around in a circle at this point.
But why are we resistant to this? I
Well,
guess
from what I understand, if a decision isn't made fairly soon, and whether it's the 7th or shortly after that, you lose a window that it's an entire year. So you're asking for a delay to
No,
look
now,
at something.
I
Let
understand,
me finish. You're asking for a delay in something that the only thing you know for sure is that it's going to delay the entire project for a year.
Now we're at that point. I've been asking the same question for 2 years. So it's not a fair statement to say, hey, Dr. Berman, when she literally put in black and white to me, if yes, we're going to clearly do a cost feasibility analysis of multiple sites, black and white, right, of 2022. That never happened. So that is the concern I have. It's not that I'm the problem now. It's that we've been asking the same question for multiple times and have never actually done the work.
So let me ask you whether you think that if Edna was proposed as a site, that would be consistent with the bond language.
Yes, just as the same argument that the school district made that going to Friends Field was consistent with the bond language, because when you read down in the bond language, it doesn't promise any of the projects, just as the lawyer walked us through. What it says is this bond money allows us to do site acquisition, site refinancing, site leasing, anything except for SG&A, basically, you're allowed to go do. So it is clearly within the bond measure.
Well, that clearly wasn't the conclusion that all parties had. And
I think I read the same.
pardon me?
I think I read the same, and I think he even alluded to some of that earlier today.
What?
That language that Chris Bailey
The
just
project list is a proposed project list, which will or will not be built. None of it may be built. But basically, the bond measure goes and puts forth a lot of carte blanche that the district has. It's something I even disagreed with on the Friends Field counter argument that we could have built at Friends Field if we wanted to, just as the district said, completely in our legal right to move locations of the site.
So if you look at, I mean, I don't mind this discussion back and forth. If you look at the facilities master plan, which was thoroughly vetted with the community, there is no middle school option for Edna. So, we are tying,
Yeah, I understand.
we've
We're
got a
all in the
bond,
gray-
we've
we're
got
all
a,
in the
let
gray
me
area.
finish.
Yep.
We've got a bond. We've got bond language that refers to the middle school. We've got the master facilities plan, middle school. And you're suggesting tonight that there wouldn't be a whole
Right.
room full of people who would be coming out of their minds.
Of course there will.
Okay.
Of course, there's going to be a room full of people coming out of their minds when they realize that we're putting temporary housing right there. I promise you. So there's going to be a room full of people with all different concerns that have different pockets. All I'm saying is the legal interpretation of how the bond was put out would allow a lot of authority for the district to make decisions as to where those projects and those monies are spent.
I'll go back to the fact that the bond language that you're referring to in that particular sentence leaves it up to the school district to decide whether it's economical or in the best interest of the district. The district has made the determination that the Edna school is not in the best interest of the district. So you can refer to the bond language all you want, but the district has already made that decision.
And I'm concerned we're going to be back here in 6 months when other findings come up. So that's why I'm saying it's good to run a plan B and to financially prudently go and look through, which again, I was making the argument from looking at previous CBOC, authorities to go and say, let's just think through the process and the protocol and how we think through things to make sure we're being prudent with taxpayer money. So again, that's just where I'm laying out that it would be prudent with taxpayer money for us to ask the question of please present what the feasibility would have been.
To do that, you're willing to miss the opportunity for getting the interim housing in place to keep going ahead?
I think it would be a few week process delay to go and actually put together a feasibility and ask for a number on it. And for me, like a multi-year, 5-year commitment with this amount, that's a rational request I've been making since the very first CBOC meeting I attended.
Is it realistic that it can be done in that short of a time frame?
how long did it take to put together the simple high level of a Friends Field versus this location, right? I mean, the contractor was able to put together a comparison. It's not going to be a perfect, but you're able to put together a comparison of a cost analysis of one site versus another. Here, it's a little bit more complicated because you have to go and cost out the elementary school expansion, but it is still possible to, within a 30-day period, get a high level estimate of the feasibility and the cost of an alternative plan that takes that into account.
And does it solve some of the problems that people have for this site, such as the flood stuff and the sewer stuff and the moat in a couple decades? I mean, I don't know those things, and I trust that the board has really done their work, and the two of you, I appreciate all the work that you have done, but it seems that these questions would be easily answered when asked, and I guess I'm a little still in the dark. And it's not that I'm saying that work hasn't been done. I believe it to be done, and I appreciate all the public service and the work that you do, but it's a big decision. This is going to be here for 50 to 100 years, is what some folks have said. And for us to take maybe 30 days just to answer this question, I think would give a lot more confidence to our suggestion of what we're spending this money on. I'd like to hear from other people on the committee. I'm a little more vocal, I guess,
Other
tonight.
comments?
Can
I
it be
just
done in 30
know-
days? And
Just
can we
know
propose
this
it?
committee is not job to pick the sides. I think that's my opinion. And I just feel Etna, and I think previous report indicate Etna site is too small for the middle school to meet the ratio of the state requirement. I think this should be the design team. And also the traffic. If you've been to Etna, the road is much smaller in a residential neighborhood. I just don't feel it has the same advantage of this current site.
So I invite any other comments. If not, I'll. If you're interested and you wish to make a motion, we'll entertain the motion.
And what is it the motion is basically say, for the next 2 weeks or 30 days, or what's a reasonable time for them to be able to provide that to be satisfactory to the board?
It's your motion.
It's my motion. So my motion would be, let's delay for 30 days to see the feasibility study or this internal study that they did on Edna.
So I want to be sure I understand the motion. Are
And
you
Chris,
moving?
maybe you can help me.
No. Since this is a motion that will be voted on by the voting members.
Is
I'm
Chris
bringing-
is not a voting member?
No.
Oh.
He's an alternate.
No.
So
Who else are alternates here?
those
Just
two.
Joy and Chris. Oh,
Right.
okay.
So I've given him a fair amount of license tonight, and it's been an interesting discussion.
Do we even have the authority to make a decision to delay anyone? I think
Well-
we can request information, but we can't actually tell them, you can't make a decision next Thursday or whatever it is, right? We can only request at most. Is that correct?
So would you frame your motion and we'll see if it's got a second?
I request information to see a feasibility study that done on Edna versus the cost comparison for Mill Valley Middle School.
So you're requesting the Board of Supervisors? I don't want to write.
Who
your
would
motion.
be the group that would provide that? The Board of Supervisors?
I'm sorry, the Board of Trustees?
The Board of Trustees?
Would
Yes.
you state it again?
Okay, could you help me out, please?
So I think what I'm hearing you say is a request that before the Board of Trustees vote on the matter of interim housing on the 8th, that the Citizens Bond Oversight Committee would like to see additional information relative to the Edna alternative.
Okay, and including the cost.
I'm
Yes.
trying to put
That's
it
great.
in a form. So is there a second for that motion? All right, seeing none. Thank you for the motion. That's it.
There is no second? Wow. Okay.
It's, I think we've had a series of discussions about where we can go. And I think we've been stepping out probably as far as we can, but I'll just say for the final time, from my perspective, the Board of Trustees has already addressed the issue.
But
And
we've never seen anything about it. So how can we analyze what the cost was in terms of the comparison?
I would just urge you guys to think about it. This can come back to bite you later. It's a good thing to have.
Chris,
in-
that's really
in the
not
record.
necessary. Can you?
So I want to rephrase it, that having data or requesting data, there's no harm to it. The Board of Trustees can choose not to present that information. I don't know why we wouldn't request that data. I have no vote here, but I don't understand why not request it and have them present it or not. Go back to the board meeting where Edna was presented as an option. There's not a single dollar put on the page. There's pros and cons of the sites presented.
Well, best interest in the judgment of the Board of Trustees of this district is not only a quantitative assessment. Yeah. Okay. With that, I think we're done with these issues and we'll move on to item E, which is committee business. Let's see, approving the minutes of the last meeting. I was away with COVID, so I wasn't present. There are only 2 members, so we aren't in a position where we could approve that. So we'll push that. Form 700 review, that's an issue just to bring to the attention of the 2 new members that we had a go around about what needed to be disclosed on conflict of interest, and the rest of the board members will deal with that at the next period that comes up. And finally, election of a committee chair and vice chair. We only have a couple of, well, we have an adequate number here, I think. So any nominations for chair?
Nominate Roger to be the chair. I think you're the most qualified.
You need a second?
Motion and seconded. Any other nominations? Seeing none. I'll put that to a vote. All in favor, aye.
Aye.
All right, vice chair? Anyone interested? I know Susan had mentioned that previously at the second meeting that she would consider that. If we're not coming forward with somebody tonight, we can put that over to the next meeting. Okay. Any other, let's see, the only other business that I'd like to raise as part of committee business is to think about committees. And I think one committee that would be useful, as I've thought about it over the last few days, is to have an executive committee. And I would like to have an ad hoc executive committee right now starting. I thought that would be the chair, the vice chair, and a third member, but I'll put that on for the next business. Just committees generally. Any other items people would like to see for the next meeting?
Just a question on the committee. Does it violate the Browns Act requirement that you meet separately?
If you have a committee of 3 and there's 7 members, it's not a majority, so that's allowed. So committees often function in that fashion.
I just have a question. If we do request access for a lawyer for interpretation, how are those funds awarded to us and what do? We vote for that so that we can understand some of these legal things and so that we can understand where our boundaries are? What do I need to do that? Do I need to say a motion again
Um,
to vote for access or funds for access to a lawyer so that we can understand the interpretations
So
of
I,
these statutes?
I think that what we would do if that's the interest of the group, then we would make a request of the district to provide funds for that.
Okay, I would like to make a request for funds for an attorney so that we understand where our boundaries are.
Sorry, just to clarify the boundaries, you're gonna ask them boundaries of us as a CBOC or the bond
Well,
language or
the
both?
bylaws versus the statutes that the gentleman who spoke from Friends Field spoke about.
Okay,
Do we have a second?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I was trying to clarify whether you can you make that motion if it's not on the agenda?
I think that's a good point. So since it wasn't agendized, we will have to take that up at the next meeting and we will do so. In the interim, I will, based on this discussion, have discussions with the district.
I mean, I don't understand that it wasn't on the agenda, but we did have conversations about it and it seemed like there was some confusion about where our boundaries were. So does it need to be on the agenda for us to be able to request for
Well,
this?
it's a
or-
board action, and so actions have to be on the agenda.
Okay, and it's just not because it's,
Just to clarify, I don't have an opinion. I think it's probably not a bad idea to have a lawyers in representing this board as opposed to the other parties. But my understanding is how the board works is that you have to have it on the agenda so that anyone who would be concerned, for example, about us spending the fund money, for example, to hire a lawyer, would be able to make a public comment and give their opinion about why we should or shouldn't be able to do that. And so we haven't given people time to do that, and that's why we'd want to wait to have it on the agenda.
I think that's a correct statement. That's,
thank you. Can I request that it's put on the agenda for our next meeting?
yes, certainly.
Thank you.
Any other business? Motion to adjourn then?
Second.
Okay, all in favor, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.